Their data centers and cloud technology are changing the way I live, learn, and reach for my dreams.
They're working hard with their partners to reimagine what the future of shopping looks like and are helping our business stay prepared for the demands of our customers.
They help me and my staff stay secure, whether working from home or from the office. Please excuse the noise, guys. School's just closed. Ensuring that all our sensitive information
Does not land up in the wrong hands. They monitor forecasts to keep me moving. I heard they even monitor fuel pipeline all the way from Mozambique. They create and manage software that helps to keep the retail supply chains going. Okay, and did you get the money I sent you?
They enable nearly 200 million transactions a month.
Their underground Wi-Fi helps to keep miners safe and in touch with those above ground. They help to bring wealth to the surface.
They take care of your technology,
so that you can focus on your customers' needs.
BCX, our most important customer,
Is yours.
Ladies and gentlemen, hello and a warm welcome to the 2022 Directors Event. My name is Gugulethu Mfuphi and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this virtual event where, of course, once again, we'll be engaging in critical matters that are top of mind for business leaders and executives and key stakeholders alike within South Africa's economic society. Well, I must tell you that over the last 2 years, we've certainly come through what has been a tumultuous time, not only battling the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, but its impact and influence on our lives, our livelihoods, and of course, understanding the economic fallout of the consequences as we reflect on the lockdown. But coupled with that, as we now shift into a new space where we're looking to adapt and evolve towards the tail end of the pandemic, we continue to be plagued by ongoing risk factors. Consider rising inflation, the impact on the global supply chain, a hawkish stance that's being taken by central banks across the world over, and of course the heightened risk for stagflation as we raise concerns about a potential recession that we might experience in some of the powerhouses of the world's economy. Coupled with that, South Africa in itself is still plagued by legacy issues, and yet opportunities still remain. Today's conversation and theme and overall highlight of the Directors Event will really look to unpack many of these ongoing challenges, but most importantly, explore new opportunities as to how best we find the shortest, most convenient, collaborative, and of course, sustainable avenues to rebuild South Africa's economy. So we are excited to have you with us over the next few hours as we look to evaluate and clearly get some insight into many of these critical themes that play a key focus in our lives and livelihoods. I'd like to again welcome you once more to the 2022 Directors Event, where we seek solutions to find tangible outcomes to conversations that impact critically on South Africa's economic outcomes. Well, I must remind you that, of course, as we always do within these particular conversations, not only will robust communication be served, but of course some tangible solutions will also be sought. But that doesn't mean that you're excluded from this conversation. So despite us gathering once again in a virtual realm, we do invite you to actively make use of the chat service and platform that you're viewing today's conversation on to ensure that you're able to share, communicate, and of course, ask and probe our various speakers, moderators, and panelists today on key themes that you believe might be critical to the solutions that we need to source. So please feel free to make use of the chat facility. And maybe to get things going, you can also send your greetings and share your excitement as we look to engage. And hopefully, in a year's time, we'll all be able to gather once more in person as we can interact and share these views. Coupled with that, I do want to remind you as well regarding a few of our house rules that given that today's event is a virtual engagement, we are quite tight on time and will be succinct in our conduct in terms of communication and presentations that will be shared. We don't want to limit you, though, in sharing and communicating this information with many other members of the public, so feel free to engage, highlight, and post on social media. The official hashtag to use is hashtag #ST_directors event, hashtag #ST_directors event. Once more, it's quite critical for us to remember that these kind of conversations would not be possible without key and strategic partnerships. And on that note, we'd like to thank our headline partner, BCX, for enabling this discussion and for being a partner that has journeyed with us along these particular conversations. We'd also like to thank the Institute of Directors in South Africa for their continued support. And of course, you, for making the time to participate and engage. Well, ladies and gentlemen, a reminder that this particular platform does allow for your open participation. And of course, whilst it is virtual, we do ask for your attention, your participation, and your involvement in conversations. But if you happen to miss a few slides, miss a few presentations, we will be sharing a thank you mailer with you in the upcoming days following the conclusion of our board meeting today. Now, this is for more than one thing. Not only for you to perhaps seek and solicit feedback and insight into the conversations that we've participated in today, but also for you to share your feedback with us. We want to hear from you regarding the outcomes of our directors event this morning. And in this mailer, not only will you be able to share some of your thoughts with us, but we've added a bit of a sweetener to encourage you to participate more. And that is a voucher that will be made available to you, a take-a-lot voucher worth 1,000 Rand. And if you ask me, given the current plight of our economy, rising levels of inflation, I think it's a voucher that we all might need and would put to good use, especially during these chilly times. So on that note, we've set the tone, we are clear in terms of the conversations that we're going to embark on, and most importantly, also looking to actively engage in sourcing some solutions to South Africa's economic challenges. On that note, as we look to set the tone for today's conversation and hear from our various speakers and representatives, allow me to introduce our first speaker to commence our proceedings. Ladies and gentlemen, if you can, a warm virtual applause and, of course, some of your excitement as we welcome the editor of the Sunday Times, Sthembiso Msomi.
Good morning and welcome to the 8th year of the Directors event, proudly presented by the Sunday Times and BCX. We are delighted to have you with us for the 8th year of what has become fondly known as South Africa's biggest board meeting. What a tumultuous year the country has had in the face of the COVID pandemic, and an event that has dominated news cycles for nearly 2.5 years already. It has sometimes been a distraction from some of the other hardships plaguing South Africa, which is why the Directors event is so important. It focuses the minds of business and society on issues that unfortunately have not gone away or can be ignored. Nearly a half of all South Africans spend their days hungry, not out of choice. With the war in Ukraine affecting fuel prices, we have seen food prices skyrocket. Climate change is threatening our natural resources with unpredictable and extreme weather patterns. We only have to look at the devastation caused by the recent KZN floods to realize how fragile our supply chains are in the face of it all. It makes getting enough food to people affordably challenging. Think about it. A standard loaf of bread will see very little change from a 20 Rand note. Living is expensive, especially when you are poor. And we are still one of the most unequal countries in the world. The gap between the haves and the have-nots is growing. This should be a concern to all of us. How are we going to fix the economy to a point where every South African can live with dignity and above the breadline? We simply can't afford to sit back and accept our lot among the fragile five. We are still a young democracy, and our people deserve better. And that is why we are here today with you, key decision makers and leaders in business and society, so that we can raise our heads above the sand and work towards something better. Thank you for being here today. It means you care. Once again, we'd like to thank our partners, BCX, for their ongoing commitment towards seeing a better country for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Sthembiso for opening up today's discussion and most importantly also highlighting a few of the outcomes that we can anticipate today. Clear challenges that we are well aware of, and we will be hearing from various representatives and speakers as to how we need to adequately address many of these themes. No doubt you might have heard about partnership, right? And BCX has been a key partner in enabling these conversations over the last few years. Of course, quite critical in the role that it serves in South Africa's economy, as well as a key participant in not only innovating, but also unlocking new opportunities for both business, government, and society overall to benefit from when it comes to technology. Well, to share some of their opening remarks and, of course, give us some feedback and insight, let's warmly welcome the CEO of BCX, Jonas Bogoshi.
Right, thank you very much, Gugu. It is amazing that we have been having events with Gugu, and we have never met physically. It's the first time that I meet Gugu, so thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, and welcome. Welcome to the Directors event, South Africa's largest board meeting. It is a pleasure to have you be with us today. It is a pleasure to see you joining the meeting. I must say that we are a proud sponsor of the event, but personally, I look forward to this event every year. I look forward to it because of the importance. This is a platform, an opportunity for leaders to engage, to reflect, to listen, and it reminds us of the role and place we have in both society and business. And it's for that reason that I always want to come to this event. I must say that one of the important things that this event does, it gives us an opportunity to ask that fundamental question, that fundamental human question. What can we do to make things better? What can we do to make things better? It is that simple and that complicated. And it's a question that we should be asking ourselves every day. What can we do to make things better? A few weeks ago, I traveled with colleagues of mine. We attended an event overseas on technology and innovation. We could not help but admire the country that we visited, from the efficiency of the immigration at the airports to the adoption of technology in all the industries, whether it is healthcare, financial services, retail, etc. And as we were traveling that country, we admired a number of things. And the questions that we asked ourselves were the normal ones that South African asked. And the question is, why can't South Africa be like this? Why can't we be like this? The questions morphed and changed to, what role can we play to make sure that South Africa does not remain behind? You see, the first question, why can't South Africa be like this, assumes a third party, government maybe, somebody who must change things. The second question, what can we do to make things better, is the question that this forum must ask, is the question that this forum must answer. Being from the IT industry, I have to be very careful to assume that every problem of the world, all the problems of the world will be solved by technology. That's not true. We always have to temper with that view. However, going overseas, it became clear to us that the fourth industrial revolution is real and is fundamentally impacting how people work, live, and learn. Listening to some of the case studies from some of the countries, it became clear to me, quite clear to me, that most of those countries did not succeed because they didn't have any challenges. They succeeded despite challenges and constraints. And typically, we in South Africa, we think more and more of constraints when faced with a problem. As an example, a couple of years ago, we presented a solution, in a forum like this one, presented a solution on how we are piloting automation of mining operations. And the first thing that people asked was, if you're automating mining operation, you're going to have a negative impact on South Africa's employment rate. That's true, that's real. But I don't know of anybody who's preparing their children or grandchildren to be miners out there. Not only that, the question assumes or almost implies a kind of arrested development where things will not change over time. When we talk about e-commerce, the first question that people ask is that be careful. E-commerce, digital solutions assumes that we've got the right skills in development, the right skills in data analytics, and we don't have those. That's absolutely correct. Sometimes people warn us, caution us, that when you start taking things online, you are attracting cybercrime. We don't have cyber security in abundance. That's absolutely correct. But my question is the following. Why can't we build those skills at scale? What stops us from building those skills at scale? Because what the pandemic has shown us is that faced with what we believe to be a burning platform, we are able to identify solutions and we are effective in implementing them. And that, for me, is what we should be doing. So as part of BCX, we have asked the question, why can't we develop these skills at scale? Yes, we were encouraged by what we saw overseas, but we were inspired by examples here in the country. As an example, insurance companies that have taken upon themselves to fix potholes, or organizations like a Gift of the Givers that have decided that they will do something to give people hope and dignity. On that note, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the meeting. I hope that we'll have an opportunity to ask the question, what can we do to make things better? Thank you very much. Welcome to the meeting.
Since 2019, the BCX Digital Innovation Awards have celebrated and recognized digital innovation excellence in South Africa. This year marks its fourth year running, and BCX is proud to announce that the 2022 awards are now officially open for entries. If you are a South African SME, corporate or public sector organization, you can enter your latest and greatest digital innovation achievements and stand a chance to win the title of 2022 BCX Digital Innovator of the Year. Entries close 31 August 2022. All entries are free. Enter online at www.bcx.co.za or follow #BCXDIA. Invent, evolve, unite.
Well, thank you so much again to Jonas there for giving us his introductory remarks. And it does feel like quite a long time, right? The last time we got to interact and engage. Many of us perhaps just know each other from our initials and faces, looking like a thumbnail on screen. But great to see that as the world is beginning to open up, we're aware of South Africa also making some advancements and changes to alleviate the pressures that we do see in terms of COVID regulations. But that doesn't mean that we become lackluster in addressing the healthcare concerns of our country. So those are themes that we do need to be cognizant of going forward. Speaking of innovation and technology, we are excited to have many of you joining us on our platform and of course have noted some of your greetings. Many of you all the way from Amanzi Mtoti, other places across South Africa, all taking the time out to join us this morning virtually. So we note the applause, we see your good mornings, and of course many of you saying that you're quite excited to share some of the insight with us. A reminder that of course we do live in a digital age and innovation is at the forefront, but technology is a good friend. Sometimes a fickle one. So if at any point you do experience any technical challenges, as has been directed in the chat, please do make sure that you use the link that's been provided, ensure that you've registered accordingly, and maybe the challenge might be on your end, so double check that you do have adequate access and connectivity in terms of your Wi-Fi. And of course, should load shedding strike, please do be mindful of coming back to join us on the link after having been able to re-establish any power connectivity that you might have. And that takes us to, I guess, the nimble effect that we all participate in as South Africans, right? We're all well aware of the fact that when any particular challenge does come about, that we do need to be flexible. We need to pivot, as we've so often heard in 2020. And most importantly, also ensure that as we pivot and evolve and meet our challenges at the forefront, that we do this in a manner that is cognizant of the participants that we're journeying with, those within business, those within the public sector, and of course members of society, ensuring that the development and growth of all South Africans is and remains a key priority. Well, ladies and gentlemen, as you continue interacting on the platform this morning, we're now going to take a look at our Keynote address, an institution that has shown us that we cannot live in a world where we only prioritize profit, but purpose is also at the forefront, reminding us about the importance of shared value and how it is that by focusing on socio-economic development and the involvement and participation of all South Africans, that we really can rebuild an economy that thrives for all. So as we take a look at our first keynote address this morning, let's warmly welcome in this pre-recorded address the founder and chairman of Gift of the Givers, Dr. Imtiaz Sooliman.
It's wonderful to be speaking to directors of companies and people interested in the well-being of South Africa. Thank you very much for this invite. Before I go any further, I need the audience to understand the ethos of Gift of the Givers. I didn't get up one morning and say, let me form an organization, see what the needs are, draw a list of founding principles, get a group of people. No, it never happened like that. Gift of the Givers has a spiritual basis, a spiritual teacher who commanded the formation of the organization. This happened in Turkey on the 6th of August, 1992. I met a spiritual teacher the year before in Turkey. I was back in Turkey in 92 at 10 p.m. on a Thursday night, the 6th of August. The spiritual teacher was sitting in the corner of the room. I was in the other corner. He makes eye contact with me and eye contact heavenwards. And then in fluent Turkish, I don't understand a word of Turkish, but I understood every single word that he said. He tells me, my son, I'm not asking you. I'm instructing you to form an organization. In Arabic, the name will be Waqful Waqifin. Translated, it means gift of the givers. You will serve all people of all races, all religions, all colors, all classes, all cultures, of any geographical location and of any political affiliation. But you will serve them unconditionally. You will expect nothing in return, not even a thank you. This is an instruction for you for the rest of your life. And remember, my son, that whatever you do is done through you and not by you. This was a spiritual connection. I told you I don't speak a word of English or Turkish, but I understood every word of Turkish he said. At some point I asked him, I said, teacher, how is it that when you speak Turkish, I understand, and when other people speak Turkish, I don't understand? He said, my son, when the hearts connect and the souls connect, the words become understandable. I told him, you gave me this instruction. What does it mean? What am I supposed to do? I'm a general practitioner in private practice. I have 3 surgeries in a place called Pietermaritzburg in South Africa. Am I supposed to do what you want me to do in weekends, public holidays, after holidays, school holidays, when and what? He told me one line, you will know. For 30 years, I do know what to do, how to do, when to do, what not to do. The moment I walked out of the place, that same night, by inspiration, it came to me to respond to the civil war in Bosnia. And we took in 32 containers of aid in August 92, another 8 containers in November 92. And in 93, we designed and delivered the world's first containerized mobile hospital, a product of South African technology, built in Pretoria, the first of its kind in the world, and took it from Africa into Europe. Those 3 events guided me. That gift of the givers, in essence, was going to be a disaster response and intervention agency. Everything that we do after that will be around disasters, disasters being the key focus. We have 21 different types of projects, not 21 projects, 21 different categories of projects, and each category has subcategories. We started off with international disaster. We then built from tents, blankets, food and medicines. We took in primary healthcare teams, trauma teams, post-op rehab teams, trauma counselors, search and rescue teams, took in sniffer dogs, specialized equipment for medical and search and rescue, built hospitals, supported agriculture, built homes, provided tents, blankets, and medicines. And by that point, we were the most complete disaster agency in the world. No other agency in the world does all of the above at the same time. We're the only guys in the world that do that. As the years passed on, in November 2016, I cut international marketing, not the projects, only the marketing, because the media locally were focusing too much on international projects and didn't know what was happening locally. And the country needed to know what was happening locally. In 2017 came the first big local intervention. That was the Knysna fire. At that point, the country then understood the capability of gift of the givers. We sent in 2 lady managers who controlled the distribution and packaging of 20,000 food parcels. Checker ShopRite gave us their car park in Knysna to do that. The local people came with buckies and forklifts to help offload the big trucks that were coming in. The local people got together and assisted our teams that managed all of the local people to do those food parcels, hygiene packs, distribute the blankets, sanitary pads and diapers. We then sent support for the firefighters. We've provided meals for the firefighters twice a day for the entire period. We brought in specialized medical personnel and advanced life support ambulances and advanced life support paramedic teams to move patients from Knysna Hospital to the other hospitals. People then asked and said, look, the animals, our pets are hungry. So we brought in pet food for cats and for dogs. And then somebody came and said the elephant in Elephant Park is hungry. The wild animals in the bush are hungry. The cows and the sheep are hungry because there was a drought here before this big fire came. And the drought is still on right now. Provided fodder for all those categories. And then a man walked in and said, I need sugar. And I said, didn't you get sugar? He said, no, I didn't get, but it's not for me. So I said, who's it for? He said, it's for the bees. And I was stunned. I was shocked about bees eating sugar. On further explanation, he said, because of the drought, the plants that the bees eat on, survive on, were destroyed. The fire destroyed 300 beehives. Each beehive holds 75,000 to 80,000 bees, which means that 22 million of the Cape honeybee was destroyed. He needed sugar because there was no plants and the pollen nectar substitute was far too expensive. We funded the 300 new hives, money to regrow the plants, money for sugar, or we provided the sugar, and money for the nectar substitute. That project is now fully functional. It has been a source of research, and many, many school and university students have gone there to understand bees. The Cape honeybee is the most versatile in the world. It is deployed and deployed, which means that if the honeybee dies, the queen bee dies, the other bees can remanufacture a new queen bee. That's how versatile and resilient that bee is. It had to be saved at any cost. In the same year, we intervened in Sutherland. The drought there was killing the sheep count. 440,000, the sheep count eventually dropped to 31,000. You couldn't afford to lose those merino sheep, one of the best sheep in the world. You couldn't bring any other sheep, they won't survive. The merino sheep had developed an environmental intelligence, knowing which plants to eat and which ones not to eat to survive. We took in millions of rands of fodder and truckloads of support, and eventually in January this year, We supported our team members, Jan and Samal Fasaki, who put up a special pellet producing machine that's fortified with nutrition at a very low cost, the cheapest in the country, that can be provided to the farmers so they could feed their sheep not in the open field, but in an undercover controlled warehouse where animals will not attack the sheep. For the first time since 2017, the sheep count is starting to rise. Farmers are having more sheep to sell. They're having more wool to sell. Their numbers are multiplying and they're starting to take on more labor. As part of our responsibility, we try to expand the reach and benefit the country in many ways. In the same year, 2017, the disaster management called us in Beaufort West. The water system had collapsed. There was no water. Nobody could find water. We sent in our geologist, Dr. Gideon Groenewald, and we found water to drill 7 boreholes to push the water through the Gamka Dam, down with gravity, into the city, into the reservoirs, and support the city. We got involved in Day Zero in Cape Town in 2018. Brought in 300 containers of water, 300 containers of water from Joburg and Durban by ship and by road. We drilled boreholes in Cape Town, and people need to understand, Cape Town is not Western Cape. It's part of the Western Cape. It's not the only part of Western Cape. There are lots of suburbs on the outside, a lot of rural areas required support in terms of water and drilling of boreholes. We did that. In 2019 came our intervention in Makanda, and we're still there, and we're there again this month. As we know, the dam levels have dropped substantially in Kabeja, and it's in a serious problem right now in the Eastern Cape. We got involved in Makanda, drilled 15 boreholes, including 3 in the university, 7 in Wainek, where the water plant is, in the SAPS, at the Settlers Monument, where they have all the conferences, and also with the SPCA. We put in those boreholes, we put in filtration plants, over R1 million worth of filtration plants, put in pipelines to send in water to the different areas, and use our boreholes to load water tankers to support different areas in Makanda. We've been doing that since 2019 and in other parts of the Eastern Cape. Came 2020, COVID hit in a big way. And to get into government hospitals to provide services, it's very, very difficult. Too much of bureaucracy, too much of red tape. But we broke through. No paperwork, nothing in writing, no request. We delivered essential items for COVID to 210 hospitals nationwide. PPEs, pulse oximeters, non-contact thermometers, scrubs, high-flow nasal oxygen machines, CPAP machines, video laryngoscopes, medical supplies. We upgraded hospitals, put in beds, put in mattresses and blankets and linen. We supported the payment of paramedic staff to assisted hospitals because the healthcare workers' numbers were dropping, they were dying, and hospitals needed support. They were flooded and could not manage the patient count. We put in 10 teams to assist testing, and we had mobile teams throughout the country, even testing sports teams, rugby teams, soccer teams, cricket teams, and doing mobile testing for schools, universities, all over. We had teams dedicated to that. And as we were busy with that, when the lockdown came, the first real challenge of hunger became visible in the Eastern Cape. In June 2020, we were in a place called Paddy, and we saw the people who came for the first food parcels in that area. And a mother came and said, "Thank you very much for the food parcel. Please speak to my children. They will tell you the taste of every plant in this area. For the last 3 months, for survival, they've been eating plants." That is the story throughout the Eastern Cape. The hunger expands throughout the country. Children and adults have been eating tortoises, lizards, even cats to survive. Our teams witnessed at the dump sites. When the dump trucks came, children ran to the dump site to scavenge and find whatever they could find to eat. Thin, malnourished, hungry. We would see them putting their fingers in a peanut butter bottle, turning it around with their fingers inside, scooping up and eating whatever little grams there were in there. We saw them eating from a jam tin, serrated jam tin, which carries infection and the danger of getting cut, but they were desperate. We then supported 100 soup kitchens, besides delivering 1.2 million food parcels. And at the soup kitchens itself, children would come to the front of the queue, and some of them would say, "Please, I won't take too much. Can you give me some for my father, my mother, my brother, and my sister? They are hungry at home. I won't eat too much. Children became martyrs. They sacrificed so that family members could eat. These are the qualities that South Africans need. The quality of selfless service, of children leading the example, not looting, not corrupt, not greedy, sharing, having golden heart so that others can survive. Our country needs 4 essential principles: spirituality, morality, values, and ethics. We say government is corrupt, but corruption starts from the corporates. We need to own that fact and understand that. We have people within our systems that are part of the corruption, that tempt people with higher money and kickbacks, that inflate prices. In the end, we all suffer. Our families, our children, our extended families, grandchildren, and the future generation. If the country is so totally destroyed, none of us are going to benefit. It's time we take this seriously and change circumstances around. And in the same breath, I must give all credit to corporates. Because for the first time in 2020, when the pandemic came, corporate CEOs started overriding the CSI. To be blunt, most of the corporate CSIs don't have a clue what's going on in the country. They're appointed to do some small projects, take the register, get the BE certificate, get a tax certificate, do some PR, get some publicity and some coverage. But you don't address the real needs of the country. So when the CEO started calling and said, what can we do? How can we save the country? That's true leadership. And from that day up to today, the CEOs from all the top corporate companies in the country have been talking to us and making the interventions and speeding up processes so there's no bureaucracy and getting things done. We needed to upgrade hospitals. We needed to get food parcels to the people. We needed to drill more boreholes to provide water. And in that way, the response has been phenomenal. Then came the July unrest in KZN in 2021. There was an even bigger awareness, a bigger need, a bigger haste from corporate companies. All of them came with the same question. Is there hope for the country? Can South Africa be saved? What can we do? Not, I need to run away. I need to leave the country. I need to take my money and I need to pull out. No. They came with a different mindset. Yes, some people want to leave, but others mostly said, we want to stay here. How do we fix the situation? And the support came even bigger. That wasn't a political unrest. That wasn't rioting. That wasn't about hunger. If it was about hunger, Eastern Cape would have burned first, because hunger in Eastern Cape is endemic. Right now, as we speak, in the hospitals in Eastern Cape, children are dying of malnutrition. We partnered the government to support them with support for malnutrition, to provide 45 items of food, of a peanut butter paste and a product called Genesis. A Norwegian company has just sponsored us 15 containers of the enriched nutritional peanut paste, which is valued just over 21 million rand. And a special thank you to all the corporates for the cash funding and items in kind, food items coming in, so that we can make a difference to the lives of the people. And that brings us to the main point. Why is there unrest? Is it because of hunger? Is it because of the political chaos within the ruling parties? Is it because there's a huge gap between the rich and the poor? Is it because the poor people want to have the things the rich people have? No. Yes, this play a part of it. But the most important part of all this is that when people have no dignity, when everything is lost, when they are totally humiliated, when they see no hope, then there's no limit to what a person can do in that situation. When the child cannot get a transport to the hospital, cannot get medical care, dies from a condition that's treatable, should have never have happened, is hungry, falls down a pit latrine in the school, does not have proper teaching and education, does not have proper incentive or support from teachers or from any other part of the country, people lose hope. If corporates want to make a difference, if South Africans want to make a difference, this is the time. It is time to give hope. It is time to be spiritual, to have spirituality, morality, values, and ethics. It's not only about investing through NGOs. It is about changing our own personality and our own character. Let's help in every way. And this is where the most important intervention needs to take place. Unfortunately, we can see that all the corporates have been asking that question. People have been asking that question, how do we help and how do we save the country? Can create jobs in the construction industry. Textiles need to be brought back to South Africa. We need to cut out, importing from China. TFG, Mr. Price and Woolworths are now looking at an expanded textile program in South Africa. We need to bring back the leather industry, and jobs can be created in a huge way. The building construction industry, jobs can be created in an important way. And how do we make all this happen? We need to, and people are scared to say how to intervene, how to engage government. We lose the tenders, we lose the contracts. It's important for us to make the statement, and we make that statement boldly, repeatedly, and for quite some time now. The country does not belong to the government. The country belongs to me, to you, and 60 million South Africans. And it is our responsibility to fix the country ourselves. We need to understand the government itself, 7.2 million people's taxes cannot serve 60 million people. Whilst there is government corruption, whilst there's corruption in government, everyone in government is not corrupt. Everyone is not a bad person. There are lots of good people in government wanting to do things a good way. They are blocked, they are obstructed, and a lot of them don't have the skills how to do that. And we can hold hands collectively as a country and do it. Right now is a problem, fix the potholes ourselves, as many people are starting to do through South Africa. Fix the verges ourselves, fix pipes ourselves. People are they're opening their boreholes and providing water to places inside Durban where there's a water crisis right now. South Africans are coming to the party, and we each keep coming to the party. Teachers are saying, I'm retired, I'll offer free tuition. That's the kind of ubuntu that we require in our country, where people can make things happen at a low cost or for free or to share. And if we do that collectively, we will change our country, because there is a mindset, there is a narrative change where people want to do something to save the country. Yes, make money. Nobody's stopping you from making money. But do it the right way, the honest way, give better salaries, and if we can, provide medical aid programs for all our staff as far as possible. We are engaging in medical aids to see if they can provide packages at a cheaper price so that more people can fall into the system of medical aids and private healthcare. And those who can't be part of that system, collectively as the country, as corporates, as government, as ordinary people, as those who are earning high salaries, let us upgrade the healthcare system, spend on more personnel, provide salaries for nurses, for registrars, for interns, for a few years until our financial situation within the government corrects itself. We lost too much money with state capture, with currency fluctuation, with COVID-19, with the loss of trade and economic collapse over the last 2 or 3 years. It can get fixed up. It just needs our support for the next 2 or 3 years. I think I've covered all the essential aspects important for us to rebuild our country. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Dr. Sooliman for giving us that keynote address and analysis, and I think such poignant points that have certainly been highlighted. And as we reflect on the chat service, many of you as South Africans and members on the platform today agreeing with the sentiments that he shared. KP saying active citizenry is what we need. Dumi also following up on the suggestions. Perhaps we need to think outside the box, working and collaborating with politicians for the good of the country. And of course, also seeing a lot more feedback that really speaks to the efforts that we've seen from Gift of the Givers, and Werner also adding there, wow, it makes me proud to be a South African. And I guess that's the fundamental purpose that we're looking for, right? We're all proud to be South Africans. We're all proud to fulfill and serve the roles that we do within our economy and the communities we serve. But how do we take it a step further? And as Dr. Sooliman echoed the questions that Jonas Bogoshi of BCX asked us earlier, how is it that we make South Africa a better country? Those will be the fundamental questions that we will look to address throughout the course of today. And of course, we'll seek your insight into some of these themes as you share many more of your questions and answers with us. We appreciate the virtual applause as well. It makes us feel as though you're with us in the room. So Lester, KP, even Simon, thank you so much for sharing that feedback. And let's keep that energy going within the chat service and the virtual platform. Now, that same energy is also going to be required for us to have a very honest perspective on South Africa's economic performance, both from a socio-economic, political economics. All of these themes tend to intertwine and interlink at some point and have proven to be ongoing themes that do need to be prioritized by both business and, of course, members of government. Our next speaker is certainly going to give us some insight into the political economic environment in South Africa, and of course, perhaps even plant a few questions that we need to push further on in terms of seeking solutions. Now, I set the tone earlier, and I actually asked him on the sidelines if he's going to leave us depressed, and cross fingers with me that hopefully we'll have some optimism at the end of the day, or at least an honest grounding and perspective as to where to begin when it comes to asking these questions. We do see South Africa being propped up slightly in terms of economic growth. Unemployment still waning, inequality still a challenge, and of course expectations that the South African Reserve Bank will have to take a very aggressive stance in terms of protecting and implementing the necessary monetary policies we need to implement. And of course we can't forget the outcomes that we saw from the recent Zondo Commission and of course unpacking the various themes and aspects of state capture. So how do we reflect on the current environment and of course perhaps seek some solutions that we need to solve for here? Allow me to warmly welcome, and you can join us in person and of course virtually by sharing your applause, posing your questions and your feedback on the platform. Let's warmly welcome to share some keynote analysis on the political and economic environment in South Africa, Mr. Daniel Silke, political analyst and director of Political Futures Consultancy.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome. It is a privilege for me to be here this morning and to address you on a very difficult topic to do justice to. We live in a macro environment that is increasingly tough for all of us. And it doesn't matter whether I'm talking to South Africans or whether I'm talking to you, whether you are in Benin or in Bangkok or in Boston. Many of the great issues that currently affect us globally in similar ways all across the world. We live in an environment that really is what I call a polycrisis. Dramatic events in our recent past. I'm pleased to say some that we are busy working through relatively successfully, albeit after a difficult 2.5-year period. But nevertheless, there's a polycrisis in the world that involves, of course, issues relating to COVID, issues relating to war, and issues relating to the global climate crisis that I think has to be taken into account and has to be at the back, at least, or even at the front of our minds in every decision that we make. The world over the course of the last 2 years or so has seen any number of major disruptions, particularly in the supply chains that have created a shortage of goods across the world. As the world opened up, inflation and the demand for goods and services rose accordingly. And this issue of supply chain management is going to be a critical issue for business in future. It offers tremendous opportunities. But of course, inflation is not just as a result of that opening up post-COVID and the demand for goods as we've come out of isolation and lockdown. We've seen the US Fed, through quantitative easing, printing money over the course of the last number of years, also contributing to high inflation. So even before we got to the point where a war now exists in Europe, the specter of inflation was raising its head and raising its head quite dramatically. And the war in Europe, for obvious reasons, has exacerbated this. Just when you thought you were relatively safe in coming out of that COVID crisis and putting your head above the water, we've been plunged into a conflict that has global ramifications, and in particular for us here in South Africa. And if you didn't think that was enough, as the old saying goes, the global climate crisis also raises prices as a result of famine, as a result of heat waves, as a result of increasing storms across the world. So I think when you look at the various issues and you look to see the predictions for the global economy going forward over this next period, it's no surprise, therefore, that the World Bank has dramatically cut their global GDP forecast from 4.1% at the beginning of this year to 2.9% now forecast. I mean, that is a substantial decrease in GDP performance, and that decrease in GDP performance not only applies to South Africa, but it applies in particular to our main trading partners, who are going to be affected through lower GDP. Politically, of course, and you can see on the screen, their faces aren't too happy. Politically, the pressure is going to be on incumbent politicians, wherever you may be, and you should be shivering in your boots, as we've seen just overnight, the by-election losses suffered by the Conservative Party in the UK. For President Biden in the United States, having to defend the House and the Senate at the end of the year, becoming increasingly difficult as inflation and the pressures of that on ordinary people take effect. Now, the war in Ukraine is going to have a substantive effect on all of us, and already has. And you feel it every time you go into a store, every time you fill up your gas tank, wherever you might be. As we stand at the moment, well, you can pontificate on what the likely scenarios are going to be for Ukraine. I would argue that we'll be in a stalemate position, perhaps a frozen conflict as it is called, for some time to come. It is unlikely that one side will declare victory, although there might be some limited victories for Russia in the eastern part of the country. At the moment, there are no signs of negotiations, but there is always that potential that escalation could very well come to the fore should this conflict continue, and should the desires of Russia expand beyond just that eastern region of the Ukraine. So for the moment, from a global perspective, we are looking, unfortunately, at a longer term impact of this conflict. And the impact, and you can't see all of those details, but you can just get an idea. The impact on every aspect of the global financial economic order, just in the course of the last 2 to 3 months, has been absolutely immense, and the ongoing effect is going to be pretty immense as well. All of you by now are aware of those key exports coming out of the breadbasket regions of Eastern Europe. The soil quality of Ukraine and Russia in that particular part of the world is exceptional, and it's no wonder, therefore, that 25% of the global wheat production comes from that region. You look at that domino effect that creates. You look to see, and Dr. Sooliman has spoken about hunger here in South Africa. Well, there's direct hunger as well in the Horn of Africa right now, as those populations are already food insecure, are feeling even worse now as a result of the supply chain bottlenecks coming out of the Black Sea and coming out of that particular part of the world. So it's no surprise, therefore, that we've seen a spike in inflation across the world. Doesn't matter where you are, inflation hitting 4-decade highs. Global food prices at record highs as well. And those global food prices, as we all know, hit poorer countries more. The basket of goods that you buy every single week or every single month for poorer people across the world is comprised more of basics. And it's those basics, the price of wheat, the price of sunflower oil, that have gone up substantially. From an economic point of view, though, countries across the world who have an excess supply of commodities and are able to export those commodities relatively efficiently are the ones that are going to potentially keep their head above water during this particular period. Those big importers of commodities are the ones that are really going to suffer. And strangely enough, for us in sub-Saharan Africa, we perhaps will bear less of the brunt as a result of our our ability to export commodities. But a little bit more about that in a few minutes. I think from a global perspective, though, and South Africa really has to understand, and perhaps does understand, because she's already playing a certain role in this, that there is likely to be a fragmentation in the world. Some might call it a bifurcation in the world, but a division. The unilateral world that we've perhaps come to be used to for the last few decades or so is giving way to competing interests, to competing blocks in the world. And it does look as though we are back to the future, so to speak, in terms of a new Iron Curtain that is either being erected by the West, if you happen to believe the Russians, or is being erected by the Russians if you happen to believe the West. Who would have thought, for that matter, that speaking here today in 2022, we would be looking at all of those similar terms and labels that the Cold War brought to us during the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 1980s. And there is indeed the possibility of a redrawing of the boundaries of the world, different powers forming groupings, subgroupings, to perhaps test the hegemony of existing powers in the world. And South Africa, as a smaller nation, but nevertheless a significant nation, certainly within the African context, finds itself part of this particular issue. It's a problem. It's a head-scratching moment for our president, who has any number of head-scratching moments that he has to deal with right now. The moral dilemma for South Africa is indeed quite substantial. We've seen South Africa take something of an ambivalent attitude towards the war in the Ukraine, and that was, of course, heralded in South Africa's abstention from the vote, from the UN General Assembly vote that demanded that Russia withdraw all military forces from the territory of Ukraine. South Africa, therefore, could be said to be engaging in a form of realpolitik, as political scientists would like to call it, a system of politics or principles based on practical rather than moral or ideological considerations. So for South Africa, strategic interests, economic cooperation, perhaps making a call on where the future powerhouses of the world will be, perhaps is the practical consideration in terms of this ambivalent attitude towards the war in the Ukraine. Currently, there's the 14th BRICS Summit taking place, and it's quite clear that South Africa wants to make sure that it aligns itself with this particular group of countries, perhaps as a bulwark against the West, or perhaps as a predictor of future groupings in the world and where economic power will be. And certainly, when we look at issues relating to China in the future, China will be that big growth economy by 2030. The difficulties, of course, are many and immense. South Africa also takes a cue from other big countries, like India, who've also been ambivalent on the issue relating to the Russia-Ukraine war. And South Africa, too, just like India, understands that it has to feed its population, it has to secure supplies for its population, it has to secure oil for its population, hopefully at a price that does not push inflation to crisis limits. The Indians have to feed 1.2 billion people. They've got an inflation rate of just over 7%. They will want to take Russian oil at relatively discount prices, and South Africa too might be tempted to do that. That's the realpolitik of the position, whatever our view on the morality of the situation is as well. But certainly when it comes to South Africa's performance on Ukraine, the old loyalties, the old revolutionary loyalties of the liberation movement and the ANC play a very large part as well. But I think what's interesting are statements coming out of Russia in recent weeks. The Russian president has said that the unipolar world has come to an end. Now, this is a very significant statement from President Putin, indicating that alternative hegemonies are going to exist in the world, that it's not just the game for the West anymore. And South Africa now caught, in a sense, between her trade, business allegiances to the West and her emotional revolutionary ties, in a sense, to Russia, and indeed perhaps to a different world order. And I think that's the real dilemma faced currently by the ANC in terms of its foreign policy and its global outlook. We've seen already the South African Communist Party backing President Putin in standing up against US imperialism. And there is a warning that one has to make on this particular issue. It's one thing to keep your friends, and I think that's always important, and I can understand from the ANC perspective that it wants to keep its friends. But South Africa desperately needs foreign direct investment. It desperately needs to court all countries across the world on different sides of the ideological divide. It has to be very careful in terms of the line that it crosses on this issue. Now, if you happen to be watching this particular presentation from the viewpoint of the South African Communist Party, and you are worried about your investment portfolio, you may want to look at this chart that's on the screen. Not very clear, but it actually shows that countries that remain relatively neutral, and this was research done by the investment guru Ray Dalio, countries that remain neutral on major global issues of conflict often provide the best return on investment. So you might well argue that the disengagement from South Africa on the issue, the neutrality that South Africa seems to want to espouse, could very well help the country from an economic point of view going forward. If you can successfully play all sides during a crisis, perhaps you can gain some advantage going forward. For us in this country, our GDP still generally lagging what it should be, but we've rebounded as a country to about the same GDP as just before COVID. But we are going to be affected by the war in the Ukraine. We are, as an oil importing country, we are going to be affected, and our per capita GDP is going to be affected as a result of this. Inflation in South Africa has already breached the Reserve Bank target of 6.5%. And we know what are the key drivers of inflation, whether it's sunflower oil up about 40% over the last year, or whether it's petrol up about 50% over the last year. Central banks, including ours, are raising interest rates quite dramatically going forward. And there's going to be a real test for the ANC over the next few months as government tries to cut its public service wage bill in the face of increasing inflation and increasing pressure for public sector unions to ask for increased wages. And you've seen the very same issue occur now in the United Kingdom as well. So South Africa really has to ask herself, what can she do under current circumstances to benefit from the commodity boom that we've had? And unfortunately, we don't quite benefit sufficiently. Yes, we've had a windfall in our last budget of nearly 200 billion rand, and yes, that windfall is likely to last a little bit longer as a result of elevated commodity prices. But we've been able to take advantage of our export in commodities to some degree because the value of our commodities have increased. But the volumes of our commodity exports have not increased. And that's as a result of those logistical bottlenecks and inefficiencies in terms of our ports in particular and our Transnet rail systems. Ironically, though, Ukraine provides some opportunities. The Dutch, the Germans, the Austrians are now looking at coal supplies to help them overcome the sanctions and, of course, the loss of supply from natural gas coming out of Russia. And suddenly, dirty coal, dare I use the word, dirty coal, is back in fashion. South Africa's exports to key European markets going through the roof just in the first few months of this particular year. So there are some advantages, perhaps unintended advantages, and not particularly environmentally friendly advantages, that I think South Africa can take advantage of. But ultimately and politically, I think it's going to be a tough time. Those are the people who are upset. And Dr. Sooliman spoke about those people who feel hopeless, who really find themselves in a position of poverty and of few opportunities into the future. And there is a disgruntled youth in South Africa. And, you know, for all the pontificating that one can do, the disgruntled youth in South Africa is really our biggest challenge. It's not just a South African issue. This survey, this Africa Youth Survey that's just been completed, shows that across the continent, young people are disgruntled with their governments with a few notable exceptions. In South Africa, only 25% of young people feel that the country is going in the right way. Not surprising, given that over 60% of young South Africans are out of work. But it is going to be a tougher environment, because in an environment of war, and Cold War in particular, foreign investors look inwards. In an environment of rising interest rates, again, investors look inwards. And therefore, South Africa has to be particularly astute in creating an enabling environment to encourage that foreign direct investment. The Deloitte's Africa Attractiveness Survey, just come out in the last week, shows that we barely made it into the top 10 of Africa's attractive destinations. And when you look to see our fixed investment, well, it's not a collapse, but it's certainly an uninspiring performance of fixed investment in South Africa, well, you get the picture that we certainly are feeling the pinch. Now, the opportunities absolutely are there. The supply constraints remain as we've seen. And as global trade slows, there becomes an added imperative for us to look north to our own continent, a continent now of 1.2 billion people and 2.5 billion people by 2050. And we really should be looking at shoring up and motivating for the Africa Free Trade Agreement, which will hopefully secure a better market for our products to serve those growing economies that will grow relatively well even under difficult conditions. Lastly, on the charts, everybody, I do think that there's no great miracle here. There's no silver bullet. We know what needs to be done in South Africa. We know we need an operating environment that provides efficiencies from government. We need ethical governance. And of course, we need policy security going forward. And if you get that right, you are able to improve your GDP per capita. And if you can get more South Africans into manufacturing, technologically based services as well, I think you can at least begin to repair much of the damage that we've had. So finally, 4 points I want to make. Never waste a good crisis, as Winston Churchill said. It's a point that's been referred to many times over the last 2 years. It couldn't be more important for us in South Africa. It is crisis times with 45% unemployment in the expanded definition. We need substantial change from all sides of the political and economic spectrum within this country. But from a foreign policy side, we've got to be very careful. Let's not also be on the wrong side of history in terms of where we perhaps lay our diplomatic hat. Thirdly, it's time for action. It's time for action from a beleaguered government that finds itself in a very difficult position in the run-up to the end of the year ANC conference, a 6-month period in which I would argue there probably will be policy paralysis, as the ANC has to flush out its various dissenting factions. But it's a time for action from the ANC. It's a time for action also from the broader business community to become activists in pressurizing the government as well. It's no good cozying up to policymakers who don't perform. I do believe that this is the time for all of us and for the business community to be real activists in policy and political change as well. And finally, and I think government is committing to this more, I'm pleased to say, this is a symbiotic relationship. If you don't get the symbiotic relationship right, I'm afraid you're not going to write the GDP figures, the per capita income figures, the job creation figures going forward. There certainly is a better atmosphere in South Africa as I stand here now, in terms of the desire from business to cooperate with government. And I hope and I know that desire exists from business into the government terrain as well. When the state has largely failed to deliver, the opportunities for the private sector are huge. The opportunities for entrepreneurship are absolutely huge. And that, to me, is the real positive about a situation in crisis in South Africa. Thank you very much for listening to me this morning.
Well, thank you so much to Daniel Silke, really giving us some invigorating information there, right? Reviewing how South Africa is positioned when it comes to its global counterparts, understanding the consequences and risk factors that we need to be mindful of, and most importantly, as he highlighted, time for action, building on the camaraderie and the partnerships that we have between both business and leaders in the private sector. Public sector, actually. But that does speak to some of the themes that many of you have highlighted in terms of finding this adequate balance and, of course, building and rebuilding South Africa's economy. So to both Henri and Avinash, commenting on the dynamics that we're witnessing from a global point of view, and, of course, Avinash also mentioning inequality, that it goes beyond just politicians to resolve this issue. We really need to make sure that we have great leadership all around. Your thoughts and your comments are certainly noted. Viv also saying thank you for your thought-provoking presentation. Well summed up. So thank you there for that to Daniel Silke again. And you can keep your applause and your thoughts and comments coming through in terms of the presentation that we have here today. Well, we'll be hearing from many more speakers in just a moment as we will look to expand on some of the questions that have been raised. How do we ensure that we are able to fix South Africa's economy and propel it onto a trajectory which allows for sustainable economic growth? Well, these are just a few of the questions that we will deep dive into in just a moment in our first panel discussion for the day. Now, taking a look at the chat, I do see that some of you might still be experiencing load shedding, and maybe that might lead to some technical difficulties. As mentioned, please do make sure that once you're able to reestablish your connection, that you join back on the platform and, of course, continue to engage us. I want to remind you that in a moment we will be taking a comfort break, but it's a very brief one. Unlike in previous times where we'd give you a good couple of minutes to get a stretch, maybe fill up your cup of coffee, we're allowing you to do all of that within 5 minutes. So please do be back quite promptly as we'd like to get into our first panel discussion, allowing us to unpack the theme of fixing the economy to improve livelihoods, and making sure that that does come about with tangible solutions. We will be joined by several panelists representing very different spheres of society and business, all of whom will be sharing some of their knowledge, insight, and potential solutions that we can tap into. So do stay with us here for South Africa's biggest board meeting, and of course, keep your feedback coming. We'll be taking a 5-minute break. We will commence promptly with the remainder of the program at 15 minutes after 10 o'clock. 15 minutes after 10 o'clock. So get up a quick stretch, refill your refreshments, come back with your notebooks and some thoughtful insight that you can prepare for in our first panel discussion for today. Well, welcome back and thank you for staying with us here for South Africa's biggest board meeting, the 2022 Directors event. And of course, we've certainly started off with a lot of phenomenal insight that we built up throughout the course of this morning, hearing from various speakers and representatives about the importance of such a gathering, of course, also highlighting some of the key themes that we will continue to evaluate and distill throughout our panel discussions and conversations, and of course, really highlighting the positioning of South Africa against that of its global counterparts, against the macroeconomic climate that we're currently facing, and of course, some of the positive impact that has been made by both members of business and government, and the critical role that NGOs serve through the gift of the givers. But we're shifting gears now and looking to get some of your feedback and participation as we take a look at our first panel discussion for today. And this leads directly to the question, fixing the economy to improve livelihoods. What levers need to be pulled to ensure that we're able to attract more foreign direct investment in South Africa? Building up from what we heard from our keynote address and, of course, economic insight from Daniel Silke, what are some of the key considerations and sectors of the economy that we should be prioritizing? And most of all, how is it that representatives who are here on our panel today, together with many of you as global leaders, can also share in terms of the solutions that we need to look to? So join us for this particular panel discussion, and a reminder that you're more than welcome to participate on the chat platform, share your questions and your feedback with us. If you do have any questions for specific panelists, please do keep them succinct, to the point, and of course addressing the particular panelists by name in terms of the responses that you'd like to hear. But as mentioned, we've got representatives from all spheres of South Africa's economy. Let's welcome our first panelist joining us for the conversation focused on fixing South Africa's economy to improve livelihoods. Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Really excited to have you with us for this conversation, and one that I hope will not only stir the pot, but that will find some good news and some info to take out of the pot and implement in our different spheres that we do occupy. Again, a very quick overview and welcome to all of my panelists. Of course, having Jan joining me towards my right, Nontobeko, Hendrik, John, as well as Dr. Azza Jamin. And joining us virtually this morning is Eustace Mashimbia of Proudly SA to give us some insight from his perspective. Well, I do think there's quite a bit to cover and we have limited time, so perhaps let's jump straight into it. And Dr. Jamin, I'd like to start with you. Given your economic background, the figures and numbers that we've continued to witness, South Africa's economy seemingly back up to pre-pandemic levels, unemployment still a major challenge, above 35%, but of course also seeing that even globally, international agencies like S&P perhaps even improving South Africa's outlook. On the back of what we witnessed from our keynote presentation from Daniel Silke, in light of all this noise, what's your analysis and perspective of where South Africa's economic performance currently stands?
South Africa's economic performance stands somewhere in the middle of all this. What has impressed me in recent times is to notice just how much upheaval there has been in so many countries, both emerging markets and industrialized countries. And in the light of that, I know we've got huge problems, no question about that, but I also realize that the grass is not always that much greener on the other side. And my biggest concern about the medium-term outlook for South Africa's economy is not just what is going to happen in South Africa, but the impact of what is going to happen in the global economy on South Africa. Daniel has covered a lot of the ground there, but I'd like to just take one issue in a little more detail, and that is the fact that for the last 50 years, since on August 1971, the link between gold and the dollar was broken down, and that unleashed the ability of the financial sector of the world to create an awful lot of money. And over the ensuing 50 years, there's been a tremendous boom in borrowing, debt levels, and I think they are now threatening to come home to roost in the way in which central banks are being compelled to tighten monetary policy, not only by raising interest rates, but also now starting to withdraw the liquidity that they've been pouring into the world economy,
Yeah.
first to resolve the global financial crisis, which in turn was a function of the excessive debt, but secondly, to provide relief to COVID consumers and relief to the effects of COVID.
Yeah.
And the unfortunate situation now is that the world economy could be faced with a fairly severe downturn if interest rates have to rise. And obviously on the back of this, you've had the Ukrainian crisis, the Chinese strict lockdowns that have exacerbated supply chains and caused inflation to remain very much higher. Under the circumstances, South Africa is not the worst off. We are fortunate in being unfortunate that our economy is not booming. To that extent, and the government was not able to provide the relief that other countries were able to do. So we are not suffering from the same excesses of demand exceeding supply to the same extent as many other countries. And that may just help us to mitigate the need to raise interest rates quite as much as is the case in the rest of the world.
And maybe if I can jump on that and you can give us your forecast and expectations, given that we've seen a very aggressive stance being taken by the Fed in the United States. From a local MPC point of view, your outlook for the short to medium term in terms of interest rates and the impact it will have on business.
No doubt our interest rates are set to rise further. And we're probably going to have another 0.5% increase in interest rates in a month's time.
Sure.
And more along the line. But remember where we've come from. Prime overdraft rate was 10% or more for many years prior to the COVID crisis. We're currently at 8.25%. So even if we have another 2% increase in interest rates, our interest rates will still be no higher than they were prior to COVID. So that, thank heavens for small mercies. The other thing to bear in mind is the people who bear debt servicing are not the poor and the unemployed. It's the middle class. And what businesses need to recognize is that the very fact that we've got such a big inequality is in a sense a source of stability for business revenue, because the middle class is able to withstand a lot of these shocks in a manner that the poor are unable to.
True.
Which means that the overall level of business activity is not collapsing to the extent that might have been the case if we had a much more equal society.
Yeah, that's a very valid point. And of course, I guess working to our benefit, but of course also looking to expand on that particular base that can shift to the middle class. Nontobeko, you were in agreement regarding a number of themes that were highlighted by Azar just a moment ago, of course, regarding the economic dynamic and climate, but I guess some opportunity for resilience, which speaks to how best we can fix South Africa's economy. I'm intrigued to get some of your thoughts and even, you know, the thought-provoking pronouncements you made earlier this year when you challenged us to actually say, look, unemployment is a major challenge here, and we're not adequately addressing it from a local point of view.
I definitely agree with some of the things that you said. We might be coming at it from different angles. But I think that the unemployment in South Africa, it's a massive problem. And I don't see us as a country giving it the attention that we need to be giving it. It's every quarter we get stats that unemployment is up again. And we keep saying, oh, it's like 34, whatever, because, you know, we're only counting the people that's still looking for work. Why? Why are we only counting those people? The expanded rate for me is the real one.
Sure.
And in most places, even that is not often the true picture. Because if we are saying almost 50% of South Africans do not have work, I completely agree with what Dr. Sooliman was saying earlier. Those people have no stake in this country.
True.
Those people are completely have nothing to live for. And then we are surprised when we have the riots that we had last year.
Yeah.
I wasn't surprised. I was only surprised that it took us that long for it to happen, because you have had countries around the world where you have had revolutions happening in them, where government has been taken out of office because of unemployment rates which are much lower than the ones that we have in this country.
Gotcha.
And for our Reserve Bank and our Treasury to seem to only be interested in inflation and you only having the interest rates as a way that they deal with this is problematic for me, because they should be part of the people that are coming up with solutions as to how do we actually create employment.
And let's unpack that further, right? Because that's exactly what we're trying to do, to make sure that we can unpack unemployment and address some of these issues. You've also had very bold suggestions and recommendations as well regarding even looking at the unemployment grant that we saw, the COVID relief packages that were also offered. And of course, also bearing in mind that this does not match well when we take a look at the consumer goods basket, where there is just no balance. South Africans just purely cannot afford to survive in South Africa. What are some of your proposed solutions as to the interventions that should be considered?
Some of my proposals is that we need to, yes, there's technology, fourth industrial revolution, good and well.
Oh, now you're talking to Jan now. And we'll get there.
We have this large population that don't have those skills. It doesn't mean people are unskilled. They just don't have those skills for that particular industry.
Gotcha.
We have had in this country for years, we had a massive textile industry. We have a massive leather industry. Why are we not bringing those back? We need our roads to be fixed. We need our bridges to be fixed. We have veggies that need to be cut. You have our drainage systems, which are clogged. Those are jobs that need to be created. Our government says, oh, government doesn't create jobs. That is not true. Governments create jobs. We don't have nurses in this country. We don't have doctors. We do not have teachers.
Got you.
Who is supposed to create those jobs? Government.
Got you.
We don't have schools for our children. We don't have clinics for our children. Who is supposed to create that?
And let's unpack that further with some of your peers on the panel in terms of how best we can get active involvement from government. And maybe I'd like to come to you here, John, as someone who represents the SMME sector, right? And we've often seen that in South Africa, individuals become entrepreneurs often out of a situation and concern from crisis or losing their jobs or not being able to find alternative sources of economic activity. And that in itself speaks to the climate, the opportunity and the environment that perhaps is not creating these jobs, and then sees a tick up in SMMEs who, however, don't survive because of a non-conducive environment. What are your thoughts as to how we can correct this?
Kusa, I think you've touched on a very important point. As a country, we're in a crisis situation. And I think we have to stop creating accidental entrepreneurs. Accidental entrepreneurs are the entrepreneurs who are forced onto the situation of entrepreneurship by their circumstances. There is a role for true entrepreneurship. And what has happened since 1994, I think, is to kill the spirit of entrepreneurship, especially black entrepreneurship. What happened was we then had a very good public policy initiative called the Black Economic Empowerment, both legislation as well as policy and the regulations that followed after that. But what it did do, it was to kill true black entrepreneurship. It made it so unsexy to be a black entrepreneur. Guys like Richard Maponya were made so unsexy. Guys like Mike Nkuna were made so unsexy. Fortunately, Mike Nkuna and Richard Maponya continued on their path, as did Dr. Sam Mutswenyane. But we then had the tenderpreneurs. We then had the politically connected people who became entrepreneurs or were forced onto entrepreneurship. But the point that you make about accidental entrepreneurs is a very big one, and it's a very worrying one. If you look at the stats from Stats SA as well as from CIPC, the Companies and Intellectual Property Commission, they show an upsurge of companies that have been registered. These companies have been registered
post-pandemic or post-2020?
During the pandemic. But this is not true entrepreneurship. What it is opportunistic entrepreneurship. We have to guard against those and spare on real entrepreneurship. How do we do that? I mean, let's stop solutioning a problem that we don't properly understand. Let's understand the problem first. If you fix the environment, the enabling environment for small businesses, I think big business will automatically benefit from it. Yes, I agree completely that we need structural reform in the country, but structural reforms are mainly for big businesses.
Gotcha.
But we really need to enable the environment for small businesses.
And let's expand on that. Hendrik, perhaps you can give us some perspective, given that you straddle and interact with many of the stakeholders within the environment, as to how we can perhaps create this conducive environment to build up entrepreneurs.
I think so. I think John has got a number of good points that he raises, and that I don't think we should take away necessarily from structural employment, because it's a really important aspect to address. But if we are going to fundamentally address the lack of jobs in South Africa and some of the fundamental aspects that we need to address in order to bring back dignity and really provide South Africans a key stake in our future, so to speak, as we heard earlier in the presentations, entrepreneurship is really the answer. There's no chance, I think, over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, even if we start with a very concerted and a very specific effort in order to be able to address it, that we are going to make a dent in the socioeconomic issues that we are struggling with at the moment. So if we move from that standpoint that entrepreneurship is really the answer, we've got to take a look at how do we drive that? How do we drive that with a concerted effort that it's not accidental entrepreneurship, that it is supported in the right way? I'm pretty sure we're going to get to the technology part of it, because I mean, the investments that we've made over the past 24 months in technology, I think we can leverage to a great degree in order to be able to support entrepreneurship, because I think a lot of the investments will enable and fast-track the entrepreneurial drive within South Africa. And I think it's an aspect where business in South Africa can support significantly better, as opposed to broad-based support that we're providing at the moment around corporate social responsibility, because business is not necessarily the business of government. Business is the business of business.
Exactly.
So to speak. So our ability to support entrepreneurial activity in South Africa as corporate South Africa, I think, is significantly better.
Got you. And Hendrik, that's a valid point, because we cannot just stimulate entrepreneurship for the sake of entrepreneurship. It needs to be directed, as both yourself and John have highlighted. And that speaks to specific sectors of the economy that are ripe for this development. Is it technology? Is it manufacturing? Is it infrastructure? And I'm keen to hear from your perspective, Hendrik, if you have highlighted in your interactions some of these key sectors that are key enablers not only for entrepreneurship, but employment and, of course, the economic development of the country.
I always think it's a combination of some of the older, more traditional sectors and very much some of the new technology sectors.
Well, Daniel told us none of us are raising miners these days,
yes,
right?
Great. So slightly deviation, I think, from that point. I think on the traditional sectors, I think the situation in Eastern Europe has opened up quite significant opportunities in sectors like agriculture in particular. I think in a country like South Africa and on a continent like Africa, we've got so much arable land left that we can take advantage of. The gap left, based on the conflict in Eastern Europe, will take years, if not decades, to fill. And Africa's got a really big opportunity to advance its commercial scale agriculture in order to be able to take advantage of that opportunity and, very importantly, fill that gap for the global agricultural economy in any case. Commodities will definitely be sustained. We have to move away from just the extractive economies and move into beneficiation, which we've been talking about for decades
years,
now. We haven't necessarily done that much, I think, especially within Africa and more specifically within sub-Saharan Africa. The more technology-focused industry is very important. Allowing especially our younger generations to take part in the digital economy is exceptionally important. I think one aspect that a lot of people are not talking about is the fact that when you take part in the digital economy, you're not necessarily dependent on the health of the African or the South African economy, because fundamentally it is a global economy.
Got you.
So there are a lot of entrepreneurial opportunities associated with education, with healthcare, a lot of other services in order to take part in the digital economy.
Definitely. Yeah, and that's a perfect segue to you. And I do also want to get Eustace's feedback from a proudly SA point of view in terms of some of these sectors of the economy that we can tap into. But let's talk technology, Jan. And as mentioned, it's part of a global economy. But South Africa, I guess because we still make up less than 1% of the global economy, still needs to find further opportunities to fully leverage and seek opportunities there. From a BCX point of view, what opportunities have you identified in terms of cultivating increased innovation, investment, jobs and opportunities within the IT space?
Thanks, Gugu. I'd like to maybe just add on the entrepreneurial side, where I think technology can actually assist us to empower entrepreneurs to actually to fast track the adoption of innovation we actually bring to the table.
If they have the skills, right?
If they've got the skills, and I think the skills is a key thing.
We have that startup money.
And yeah, so there's a lot of things that need to happen. The startup money, the ability to do the registration within a short period of time, to stay compliant and all of that. So and that also that mentoring and coaching of the entrepreneurs to actually to establish proper businesses to create employment going forward. But as we look at over the last 2 years what has happened with COVID and how the adoption of technology, work from home, e-commerce and everything,
yes.
We see amazing opportunities within corporate and in small business. The big corporates that embraced on e-commerce, they are doing well. We see some of them that need to do catch-up. But we see opportunities in other areas of the business, like in the back end, in the fulfillment side. So technologies that need to be implemented there. Technologies, I think we've always been, as John indicated, we were at the forefront of innovation in the country, entrepreneurship, but we've lost some of that. So, but there's still a lot of good innovation in South Africa, and we can be the net exporter of that with some of the technology. Also, with the work from home, we've seen that a lot of our people are actually becoming global citizens providing services to other countries.
Yep.
So being employed by other global multinationals. So we should find ways to actually to embrace that and actually provide the service from South Africa to the rest of the world. If I look at Africa, in Africa we've got a massive youth that are technology savvy because most of them will actually have a mobile phone. So that assists us.
Here we are balancing several technology devices,
exactly.
right?
So they've got mobile phones. I think globally there's 6.5 billion smartphones. So it's about 80 or 90% of the world population.
Yeah.
So with the advent of platform technology and move to the cloud, we can actually assist our entrepreneurs to make their products and services not only in South Africa available, through live streaming you can make it available on a global scale.
Got you.
We've seen in Rwanda with some of the coffee producers where they actually make it available live streaming. The minister actually stood there, live streamed it to the rest of the world, and you could see the uptake of revenue for that specific area. So technology is really a key enabler. And in South Africa, but what we need to do, we need to work with the universities, we need to work with government, we need to work with corporate to actually to build those skills in the country in order to become a net exporter of the technology skills as well.
And that's such a valid point to touch on, Jan, because it does speak to the solutions that we need to find, right, in terms of those particular partnerships. And from BCX's perspective, again, given that you are a leader in terms of innovation, maybe you can tap into successful opportunities that have borne fruit in terms of these partnerships and scaling businesses and innovations perhaps that have been birthed in South Africa.
Yeah, I think if you look at some of the good things that actually happened in South Africa within, I say, in public sector, if you look at a couple of years ago, I think South Africa were at the forefront from an e-government point of view. In the early 2000s, the white papers, the strategies we actually put on table were actually leading edge. Only a few entities actually embraced that, and if you look at the likes of SARS. SARS became totally digitized.
Got you.
And how can we actually further leverage that? And we are in discussions with other entities like the Department of Home Affairs. As Jonas indicated earlier, moving into transporting into countries, it's so easy to do it. Back in South Africa, it's difficult. It's a paper-some process. Also, if you look at the masses of data that are being generated in public sector, structured and unstructured. How do we actually optimize and get real information out of the data that we can actually then know how we can actually use it to improve service to our citizens and to our people and to our businesses to make it easier to do business.
A very important resource that is that data, even more competitive than oil from what we've seen in recent reports. Nontobeko, you wanted to share some insight. There's a question, and then I definitely want to go to Eustace after that.
Okay. Now, I was just going to say, in that piece you were referring to earlier, one of the things I was saying is exactly that we need to see business working much more closely with government, especially the Department of Higher Education.
Yeah.
Because why can't we have business saying to higher education, listen, these are the skills that the market needs at the moment, and then they tailor-make courses for people to actually go and do those particular things, because when they're coming out of the education system, they have the skills that you want, and then we're not sitting and saying, oh, we don't have people that have skills, but you are giving them the skills, and then they can actually be placed in positions because they have what the business needs.
Got you. And that's a valid point in terms of partnerships. You wanted to mention something?
I just want to mention how important it is. You mentioned basic higher education. It actually goes to basic and pre-basic education.
Right.
Developing skills in mathematics and the cognitive ability of the students. Unfortunately, 80% of our schools are very ineffective in developing. That is absolutely critical to feed through into generating an entrepreneur.
But we are not investing in education.
We actually over-invest in education, but we don't get the proper outcomes that we need.
Challenges there, right, John? And maybe just elaborate on that a little bit further before we expand on, because I do see the significant focus of this conversation is investing in our human capital. And it appears as though that's the primary infrastructure, so to speak, that we should be investing in.
Yeah,
I'd
we
like
are
you
one
to
of the
expand on that
biggest
briefly.
spenders, I think, in the world on education. However, the outcomes that we get are not proportionate to the investment that we make in education.
But in the past few
And
years...
we haven't, sorry,
no, it's fine.
we haven't spoken about the real crisis. The real crisis is over the last 2.5 years of COVID, our kids have become poorer. And none of us, well, I don't hear the policymakers talking about how to catch them up. We have just had 2 classes that have exited the basic education system and are struggling with tertiary.
Yeah.
But we really have to go back and find out what has gone wrong, in the last 28 years in our education system. Why are we not getting the proper outcomes that we need from a quality point of view?
Because we keep changing the education systems.
If I'm understanding you correctly, it's critical that we do invest in our human capital. And as you say, fully leverage technology in order to enable the development of the youth. And of course, make sure that this capital that we're plowing into human development does translate into tangible outcomes for the sectors we want to develop. Eustace, I've kept you quiet for way too long, sir. But I think you can tell that there's quite a bit to get through in this conversation. And we're keen to get your thoughts, especially from a Proudly SA perspective. And one of the questions that has come through from our audience that has joined us, especially on the back of the conversation we had with Jan a moment ago focused on technology, is whether or not we should be balancing technology-driven economies with manufacturing-based economies in order to grow an overall economic outlook in South Africa. And I'm keen to get that perspective from you, given that as Proudly South Africa, not only are you a key representative on global stages to represent the South African brand, but of course, most importantly, you also have an opportunity to engage with key stakeholders who are drivers of South Africa's economic performance. Are you seeing a convergence, I guess, in Proudly South African initiatives to cultivate more growth within technology, manufacturing, as well as other, I guess, hard infrastructure growth developments in the country?
No, thank you. Good morning. Thank you, Gugu. We as Proudly South African are seeing a definite shift. I think it's mostly driven by the fact that you cannot divorce this notion of localization from competitiveness. And how else do you remain competitive if, other than adopting latest trends, adopting technology where required, ensuring that you keep up with what the world is doing? Because ultimately, as much as we are saying to people they need to buy local as Proudly South African, if the products do not necessarily match that which they are now accustomed to, because I mean we operate in a global environment and those products keep coming in, and social media and access to information makes it very easy for people to access whatever is trending out there. So if companies in South Africa are going to want to just depend on the fact that we're saying people must buy from them from an economic patriotism perspective, it's not going to work. They need to be competitive, and so technology cannot be left behind. They have to adopt technological trends in all the innovations and all the products that they're putting out there. And then it makes our job easier as Pride South Africa, because then you are saying to people that which we're asking you to buy is not just going to help you achieve whatever goal you want to achieve, whatever need you want to satisfy, but in the process you're also creating jobs. So the two are interlinked, definitely.
Eustace, I'd like to stay with you for a moment, because it's quite clear that, again, all of this does start with investment into our human capital, investment in education, which has also come through quite strongly in the comments that we're seeing from Zibuze as well as Nelius, saying that we need to fix our schools, fix education. That makes it easier to leverage technology and many other sectors of the economy that we can compete with. But I'd also like to segue now to the part regarding foreign direct investment. And we'll hear from some of your counterparts on the panel as to how it is that we can leverage our partnerships with our peers internationally in order to propel South Africa's growth. And I'm keen to hear from your thoughts. You recently participated in the Dubai Expo. South Africa was head to head and I guess shoulder to shoulder with some of its international peers. But how have we been able to leverage some of these partnerships in order to translate into capital that's invested in South Africa, which then translates into positive ripple effects and multiplier outcomes in the economy?
I think the biggest focus with taking companies to the Dubai 2020 Expo, and I'm going to take a roundabout responding to your question, but the reason why we took companies to Dubai was to try and make sure that we open them up to other markets that are out there. It's imperative for South African companies that are able to go and compete at that global stage to be given an opportunity to do so. Access to markets remains a big problem. We have an influx of products coming into the country, whereas our products are battling to find markets out there. And so the Dubai 2020 Expo platform gave us that opportunity. And the reason why we also did that was to try and stimulate demand from external sources so such that those who are in a position to can invest will know that even if the product that they want to come and bring into the country does not have a sizable share of the market that they can capture, because it might not be a product that is very popular in the country, but that there's an opportunity for them to again take it to other markets. And that is the linkage. No one who is in a position to invest will invest if the demand is not there. We need to ensure that in order to drive up that foreign direct investment, we find ways to secure the demand both within South Africa as well as outside of South Africa. Obviously, as proud as South African, we have a domestic mandate, but we never shy away from an opportunity that comes up that will enable member products from accessing those markets. And then we work with entities that have those mandates, like Brand SA, Tourism SA, like the DTIC, Invest South Africa, and all of those are the partners that we utilize this drive to attract investment into the country. Obviously, coming in as an access to market partner to drive up demand so that investors can put their money into the country.
Got you on that one. I'd like to come back to that overriding theme regarding foreign direct investment as well as unlocking even more capital. And perhaps, Hendrik, you can also share some perspective here with us. Daniel highlighted a very interesting theme, that it's often nations that straddle a positive relationship or perhaps remain neutral, right, between the East and the West, and this dismantling that we're seeing that often perform well. In South Africa, we've seen several efforts to really drive up and increase and improve foreign direct investment in the country, even through the South African Investment Forum. But what more needs to be done as we remain neutral, as we navigate going forward to see increased capital that will translate into increased jobs, increased investment in technology, increased development of small businesses, and the overall success of the economy?
I mean, as part of I guess, what we do, probably about 50% over the last 15 years that I've been with the firm has been focused around growth, right? Facilitating global companies moving into the region and
Yeah.
facilitating South African companies moving into the rest of Africa as well. And one of the biggest challenges and one of the biggest concerns that global companies have is the level of competition in South Africa versus the level of growth.
Oh.
So they always take a look at those two factors first when they consider whether they need or whether they will be going into a particular region. South Africa is, for the last 10, 12 odd years, not the gateway into the rest of the region anymore. They either go into East Africa or into West Africa, through Kenya or through Nigeria, through Ghana or whatever the case may be. South Africa is not the gateway into the region. South Africa is considered in its own right whether it is a country that the multinational would like to be in as a standalone country, which means that the growth rate in South Africa is a really important factor that needs to be considered. And always we have this challenge between whether the particular industry or the particular product grouping is going to show significant enough growth. Now, given the fact that the South African economy is not growing as fast, it opens up the second question is whether you can take advantage of regional opportunities from the investment in South Africa. And this is one of the things that we've been touting for many a year, which is we need to start integrating Africa as a region, the regional or the Africa Free Trade areas, making sure that our regional trade blocks actually function properly. Our logistics infrastructure needs to be integrated in order to make sure that we can create larger markets, larger demand markets, that we can reach economies of scale. So when multinationals look at a particular country, they don't just look at the demand in that country, but they look at the demand within the broader region, because then it becomes significantly more enticing. And we will inevitably attract a lot more foreign direct investment, not just in South Africa, but also within the remainder of the continent.
Got you. Given some of the macroeconomic factors that were highlighted by both Azar as well as Daniel earlier, is South Africa in a competitive environment to attract more of this capital? In other words, I'm politely asking, are you speaking to a lot more investors who are keen to come into the country?
I think capital is very cautious at the moment because of what's happening in Eastern Europe, and I think very importantly was also what's been happening over the last 24 months with regards to COVID. The supply chain shocks that we've seen and the way that companies are responding to that is a very important factor to take into account. The amount of additional stock that companies are hoarding in order to be able to manage those supply chain shocks are significant. If you take a look at the top 3,000 companies around the world, they currently have stockpiled 1% of global GDP in half-produced goods or finished goods in order to be able to handle the supply chain shocks, which is a very significant amount. That is tying up a very significant amount of capital that would typically be invested in emerging markets. So we are seeing a slight hesitation, but at the same time, we've also seen risk profiles of multinationals go up. So their ability and their willingness to take more risk because of what happened during the COVID era has also gone up. So it's going to be an interesting, I think, 18 to 20 to 36-month period to take a look at how all of this is going to pan out with regards to global investments. Time will tell.
Got you on that one. There's an interesting comment here from Michael who says, to further attract FDI, we need to create a socio-political friendly environment that is stable and less corruption. And sees less corruption. And I think that comes at quite a favorable time, or rather poignant time, as we've just recently seen the outcomes of the Zondo Commission, recently seen the amounts of capital that have been lost to the economy, and even further comments in the section saying, well, we witnessed that through the corrupt activity that's taken place, that there is domestic capital to deploy. I'm cognizant of the fact that we've got limited time, but I'm hoping that we can distill some solutions that we can implement in the short to medium term. John, I'd like to start with you. We have the Business Bounce Back Program, National Treasury, together with several partners looking to stimulate and reinvigorate economic growth through SMMEs. What do we need to do differently that is not similar to the COVID relief programs to really propel SMMEs into a better positioning for growth here?
The environment is getting quite tighter for small businesses and for the rest of the economic operators in the country. Interest rates are rising, the cost of capital is going to rise as well. Two things. First, let's mollycoddle the rock stars of the economy. The rock stars of the economy are supposed to be small businesses. Let us treat them as such. Let us lay out all the support that we can get from them. I just recently came back from KZN. KZN is about to have, the city of Durban, for example, is about to have 5 hours of water shedding of water cuts for the rest of the year. They've just emerged from two crises. The first one is the floods, and the second one is related to the mayhem of July 2021. We really have to actually go out and rescue that economy. We have to rescue that tourism sector there.
Got you on that one. Dr. Jameen, perhaps you can also share your insights as to
I think
takeaway points that we can implement.
I think it's absolutely critical. We've been outlined all sorts of infrastructural development projects, and it's absolutely critical that we get going on actually improving service delivery, getting the water to flow through the drains, fix the potholes, etc. There is over 1 trillion rand that has been outlined waiting to be invested. Why is it not being invested?
Get it done. Nontobeko, your closing thoughts?
Yeah, 100%. Our government needs to stop with the austerity measures. We warned about these structural adjustment programs at university, how the IMF and the World Bank told Africa to stop spending money on social services, etc., which led to those economies being decimated in the 80s and the 90s. Yet here is our government for the past 10 years or so doing that very thing without anyone saying that we should be doing this, with no reason for us to be doing that. If our government is not investing in this country, is not investing in this economy, why should a foreigner come in and invest in our society? So we need to be, this infrastructure money which our government, every year the president comes and says we're going to be working on infrastructure, but there is never money which Treasury actually gives for that to happen. We need to start doing these things. It's small little things that can be done, but we make it to be such massive issues. There are small little things that can be done on a day-to-day basis.
Got you. Jan, as a representative of business, what do you need in order to see more growth and, I guess, shift the radar?
We need the willingness of government to embrace technology. If you can actually, at this stage, you can actually open a bank account within 2 minutes. You don't need to be in the bank. Why should you take you 40 days plus to open a SMB a business? So embracing technology, make it happen. Then the other thing is, let's get the skills development going. We are about 12 to 18 months behind the rest of the world for where digital is going. At this stage, we can support the rest of the world, but at some stage, we're going to need those skills locally. So we need to start building it here, because that is the way that we can actually fuel the digital economy. So asking government, assisting us, work with tertiary educations to get those programs going. But I think the key thing is government, there's a big opportunity to, if we can streamline the government services, they can free up resources to focus on other areas of difficulties that need to be resolved.
Eustace, we'll give you a very brief 30 seconds just to share your closing remarks. What can we do to ensure that we improve South Africa's economy as well as livelihoods?
As part of South African, we're a buy local campaign. So for us, it's about utilizing that which we have at our disposal. All of us are buying a product of some sort on a daily basis. Whether you're buying for your business, you're buying as the public sector. Think of the collective procurement spend that comes from the public sector. If you consider provincial, national, local government, as well as SOEs, think of the collective spend in the private sector. If all of us just started taking conscious decisions to say we are going to support those people who are meant to buy from us, government needs more people to be employed so that they can grow their tax base. How else do you do that except through making sure that you buy from these companies so that they can keep people employed or create much needed new job opportunities? Equally, the private sector has to make sure that their customers can afford whatever it is they're offering. And so they have to also support those industries that are part of their value chains so that we can all collectively create jobs and get out of this sticky situation that we are in. Thanks.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Eustace. I think quite clear in terms of the major fundamentals we need to attend to, making sure that the capital that's available within our country is adequately used. The blueprint is there. We've got the economic recovery plan. We've had these conversations and deliberations as to what we need to focus on, but action does need to be taken. Primary focus does need to be invested into our human capital once our people are able to be innovative, to be nimble, to be agile in terms of how how they participate in the economy. That's where we will see not only the development of traditionalist industries in South Africa, but of course the use and development of new innovative themes that come about. And throughout all of that will be increased economic participation, increased economic development, and increased economic growth. So hopefully this does set the tone for moving forward and how it is that we can shift the needle to the next year. I'd like to thank all of my panelists for joining us today, and appreciative of your thoughts and insights despite the limited time that we have. But perhaps that gives us more opportunity to engage on the sidelines and also be proactive about how it is that we move the country forward. So thank you very much, Eustace, joining us virtually, and of course my panelists who've joined us here in person. And of course many of you who've shared your thoughts and your feedback, many of you are highlighting some key themes we need to focus on: improved trust, eradicating corruption, and of course going back to building positive relationships that will translate into partnerships that deliver results. We're aware that we are running slightly late, 5 minutes over time, but do stay with us, because coming up after this particular conversation is yet another theme that is quite critical to the development and importance of livelihoods in South Africa. Feeding the nation is the topic and discussion for the next panel discussion. Really speaks directly to not only the development of individuals in the country, but of course major challenges that we're experiencing on the back of what we're witnessing from geopolitical concerns as seen in Russia and Ukraine, and of course understanding that there's arable land that we should be using as a key opportunity on the continent. That conversation will be moderated by well-known and renowned South African journalist, news anchor, TV presenter, and philanthropist, Uveka Rangappa. She'll be joined by her panelists on stage. So sit tight, we'll see you in the next 5 minutes. Quick changeover, stretch your legs, grab your note pens. The conversation here for South Africa's biggest board meeting will continue in the next 5 minutes.
Very good morning to you and welcome back to the Directors Event. My name is Yuveka Rangappa and thank you so much, Gugu, for that wonderful introduction. You make me sound way more interesting than I really am. Thank you for joining us for our next discussion, which focuses on feeding the nation, one that is actually very close to my heart. But I must tell you, when I saw the topic, I thought, I have a solution. Let's just call in my mother. She'll feed everyone and give them seconds even if they don't want them. But jokes aside, I mean, there's no doubt that many of us as ordinary South Africans are trying to do our best to help our fellow humans, our fellow South Africans, whether it's a matter of just handing out that loaf of bread at a traffic light or that bag of apples, or we support our charities that feed others. We are all trying to do what we can in these very, very desperate times. And many of us, yes, can put our heads down at night and rest assured that we've, yes, provided somebody with at least one meal for the day, but it's just not enough. Let's be realistic. If all of us even did one thing in one day, it's never, ever going to be enough to end hunger in our country, around the world, but we are focusing on South Africa today, and it is an impossible task, made even more impossible at the moment by pandemics, by war, by the impact of things like corruption on feeding the nation. We're also looking at water scarcity. We're looking at just so much else that is, I suppose, it kind of gets you down when you think about it, is where does it end? And where do we even begin to find the solutions to all of this? But thankfully today, we have a wonderful panel of experts who are going to help us come up with some solutions, point us in the right direction. They're going to help us answer some questions like, how do we mitigate climate change, the impact of corruption and war on food availability? How do we manage our water resources? How do we execute a just energy transition and support agriculture to ensure that food security, so that nobody has to go to bed hungry in our country? And our panelists today, Dr. Jashila Rajput, Andy Duplessis, Professor Mark Swilling, Professor Imran Valodia, and Professor Francois Engelbrecht. Welcome. Well, we have Dr. Rajput and Andy joining us online today, and I want to say thanks to the two of you for leaving me with the professors. But they are wonderful professors, I'm just kidding. But thank you very much for taking the time. Dr. Rajput, I do understand you are being hit with a bit of load shedding, so we will try and be mindful of that with you as well if we do tend to lose you here and there. Andy, hopefully you are safe. And welcome to my in-studio guests. It's been wonderful, and I love professors, so don't take it personally. Let's get off, let's kickstart things with our first question, which is, how food secure is South Africa at the moment? And I'd like to hear from all of you. Let's start with Dr. Rajput, ladies first, just in case we do lose you, Dr. Rajput. Your take from the work that you do and what it is that you do at the moment. What you're seeing, how food secure is South Africa at the moment?
Thank you very much. And I hate to start this in a doom and gloom way, but perfectly honest with you, we have a significant challenge when it comes to food security in South Africa. It's estimated, as you mentioned, 20 million people currently go to bed hungry every night. And that's quite significant. Already back in 2011, it was estimated that South Africa has experienced food waste and loss of approximately 27% of the 31 million tons of food that is produced and imported. And this means that it equates to around 10 million tons of food that's wasted and lost across our supply chain. These particular topics are very significant, which means that as time has gone by, the problem has not improved. In fact, it has worsened, especially given the current paradigm that we face. This being from the pandemic, this being from the current weather-related crises that we experience, the external factors such as wars taking place on an external global basis. And all of this feeds into the fact that we need to double down and secure our supply chains. So I'm hoping in the next part of the panel to unlock some of the approaches that we see, especially from a value chain perspective, to secure our agricultural supply chains, but also to be able to ensure resiliency across the supply chains, all the way from production to the point of end consumer and beyond, looking at things from a circular economy perspective, as well as creating enabling environments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Raj. But to my right, Prof. Swilling, your take on where we are with food security.
I think we need to recognize that in our constitution, at section 27(1)(b), we actually state that people have a right to food. The statistics also show that over the last 3 or 4 years, we've actually produced enough food within South Africa to meet our calorific needs. But as we've just heard, a large number of people, up to 20 million, go to sleep hungry. 25% are food insecure, and between 30 and 40% have got micronutrient deficiencies. And yet we produce enough. So what's wrong?
Yeah.
What's wrong is the food system. It's not about not producing enough food. It's about a food system that distributes food in an unequal way. The two key issues are access to food and the affordability of food. And as we've seen from previous presentations, because of the accelerating global crisis, which is just made worse by the Ukraine war, not triggered by, we see increased prices. And our food system is embedded in a global food system, which is not just extremely problematic from an equality point of view, but environmentally unsustainable.
Yeah.
It's one of the biggest drivers of climate change, which then drives droughts, which then drives further threats to production.
Yeah.
And we have an industrialized food system, which is simply, quite simply, unsustainable, and we have to make a transition. FAO agrees, UNDP agrees, UNEP agrees, many of the big research agencies agrees. We have to make a transition to agroecological farming methods. If we don't do that, we're simply going to reproduce an environmentally unsustainable and inequitable food system.
Okay.
That's the challenge we face.
And we are going to tackle the hows of that possibly throughout our discussion. Prof. Valodia, you're very, entrenched in sort of the have-nots, the inequality aspects of this. Your take on where we are in terms of food security?
Yeah, I think it would be fair to say that we're food insecure. The last 2 years and kind of issues of the lockdown have made the situation kind of a lot worse than it was. But it's important to know that this problem has been around for a long time. I mean, one of the really concerning bits of data that we have in South Africa is on child stunting. So we have large numbers of children for a long time who've been stunted. And I think for a society like ours to have that problem suggests that there's something seriously wrong with the food chain. I think the second point I would make is that there's some irony in the fact that if you think about this problem from a health point of view, we kind of dealing with two things at the same time. The first is that we have those who don't have enough food, and we're seeing starvation. Alongside that, the largest health problem we're having is from those who eat, kind of eat too much. So we have large members of us of our society, and large amounts of expenditure is on problems related to health from us consuming too much. And I think the fact that we're having to deal with these two problems at the same time tells you something about about why we have why this problem is linked to inequality. That that the inequalities in the economy, that the inequalities in the food system result in these sorts of health, in these sorts of health problems. I think the third point I would make, and Mark's made this point, is that food systems are so the problem's not kind of having enough food. We have enough food. The problem's the pricing of the food, and kind of how that pricing system operates, I think is kind of something that we have to think about.
And accessibility as well, I would imagine. The food is there, but getting it to people as well is the other.
And then the final point would be the climate issues. Clearly, our food production is being affected by floods, by kind of heat, by kind of droughts, and we have to adapt the agricultural system to that. Mark's mentioned some of that. Francois is the real expert on that.
Yes, he is. And I'm coming back to Prof. Engelbrecht. I just want to go over to Andy. Andy, yes, your take on where we are, because you're on the ground with this. You work with this every day. What are you seeing?
Yeah, thank you, Rebecca. Absolutely. So I think it's important for us to understand that prior to COVID-19, we already had a food security crisis. We're beyond the crisis. We are really in a precarious situation as a country. A 2018 Oxfam report on South Africa showed that 14 million people were food insecure then, and a further 14 million people were at risk of food insecurity. What we're finding now is that convergence between the two, that 14 million that were at risk because of the pandemic, because of the riots, because of the recent floods, we're seeing roughly 28 to 30 million people that are food insecure sometime during every month. The NIDSCRAM Wave 5 report showed us that in their surveys that most people, roughly half of our country, were experiencing food insecurity for between 1 and 3 weeks of every single month. It's also important to note, as the professor mentioned earlier, that South Africa has the highest incidence of child malnutrition in the world at 27.5%. Now, this is in spite of the fact that in South Africa, we have enough food to feed all our people. But we have an affordability issue, and this is a major part of the problem, is that inequality is excluding most of our population from being able to engage in the economy. And so we're finding huge rates of unemployment, huge rates of youth unemployment, making our situation across South Africa quite precarious. It may seem on the outset that we are in a normal society. We see people driving around, we see people going to work, we're seeing the transport system work, we're seeing the agri sector work, we're seeing big business work. But underlying there's this quiet, silent, but deadly inequality across South Africa, where half of our population are not able to afford the food that they need. And so they are eating foods that are affordable, but are less healthy and causing other issues across our country. So we are in a very difficult situation across South Africa.
Thanks very much, Andy. And Prof. Engelbrecht, yes, climate change, such a big one at the moment, but from that perspective, in terms of food security.
Yes, Uveka, on top of the systemic failures my colleagues have just highlighted, we are living in a changing climate system. So the general news for our region is unfortunately also not positive when it comes to future climate change. So we produce our food in a climate system that is generally dry and also warm. And because of climate change, the general message is that this region is becoming, firstly, drastically warmer with more heat waves, and secondly, generally drier across most of Southern Africa. The big risk here is more frequently occurring multi-year droughts, so droughts that last for 3 to 6 years at an end. And the warning signs are everywhere that these droughts are occurring more frequently. Most recently, important examples of unprecedented droughts in this region have, of course, been the Cape Town drought, 2015 to 17, the current Eastern Cape drought. There was the big El Nino drought that lasted for about 4 years. It ended in 2016. It affected most of South Africa's northern provinces, Zimbabwe. Then in recent years, extreme drought leading to famine in the southern half of Madagascar and currently in East Africa. So recently, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change made an assessment that we can already detect increases in these drought occurrences across Southern and East Africa. And the next 20 years will unfortunately likely bring a further increase in the frequency and the intensity of such long-lasting droughts. And they, of course, pose direct challenges to our food security in the larger Southern African and East African region.
Okay, we are going to look even more closely at climate change and the solutions, possible solutions there. But Prof. Swelling, I want to hear from you, and I want to go to something that has had such an impact on us, and it's an outside, something beyond our control. I'm looking at Ukraine and what is happening there. Let's look at the war situation. We're talking things like maize, we're talking things like wheat, things like cooking oil, like sunflower oil as well. Now, I want to ask you, what are the risks to our own food system that sees us continuing to remain so dependent on the global food system? And I'm linking it to that because this has shown us just how dependent we are on some of these products that come from other countries. What is it that stops us from being self-sufficient in that way?
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the global food system is that we are dependent on fewer and fewer food exporting countries over the last decade or two. And an increasing amount of food is traded by a smaller and smaller number of global trading companies. So the commodity trading companies in the food sector, there are only really 4 of them, and they've become increasingly financialized. In other words, they're trading in futures and derivatives at a larger volume than the total amount of food that's actually being grown. And so we are looking at a very unstable and highly risky global financial system that we are dependent on. So what the Ukraine-Russia conflict has done is reveal the weaknesses.
Yes, absolutely.
The weaknesses were always there.
Yeah.
Yes, now, with the triggering of price rises as a result of our dependence on Ukraine as a food basket, reveals that this is the issue, affordability and access. At the same time, we must also recognize that there's a lot of agricultural producers in South Africa are going to do quite well out of these price rises. But it's going to be an export-oriented flow of food into the international market, not necessarily into the internal market.
Doesn't help us at home,
and that's also going to drive up prices at the local level. So what we are seeing is it's actually, in some ways, it's a good thing.
Yeah.
More and more people are realizing we are dependent for the most important things of our everyday survival that we do 3 or 4 times a day on a global system that is teetering on the edge. And we must do something about that now.
Yeah, absolutely. And Dr. Rajput, I want to go to you from that point, because you did speak earlier about resilient food value chains. And I want to ask you, with all of this happening, bearing just what Prof. Swilling was also talking about, how do we create those resilient food value chains for ourselves here? And what measures should we have in place already, or do we need to create to avoid food loss and waste so we can ease the situation a little bit, looking at things like dependency on other countries?
I think critically, we fundamentally need a systemic and structural approach in terms of being able to address this. At the moment, there are quite a number of measures that are being put in place, but they are addressing pockets in isolation. So we need a much more concerted effort to link across the entire value chain itself. To give you an example of this, it's estimated that when it comes to food waste and loss, in the agricultural supply chain, most of this is taking place upstream of the consumer. So at the moment, though, our actions and activities are much more downstream from the retailer point onwards. We've recently been involved in some work with the Consumer Goods Council of South Africa, where the idea behind it was that a number of entities, and so far mainly retailers, have been engaged as far as looking into reducing food waste and loss. So with this, we need a multi-tiered approach. We need to have the producers more on board. We need an education system to be able to address the types of losses that are taking place, to identify where they're taking place and finding ways to reduce it. But at the same time, we need to look into our food waste hierarchy, which means that we need to look at things such as reducing or identifying the source that we can reduce the volume of the food waste that's being generated, always being the first one, reduction. From there, we need to address things like surplus food, which is something that Andy indicated earlier on as well, that this is something that we need to find ways to feed our hungry people, to donate any extra food to food banks, to soup kitchens, and to shelters as well. But part of this means that we need an enabling environment to make all of these things happen. And a lot of this means that we need to look at it from a regulatory framework perspective. We need to ensure that our regulatory environment enables the donation of this food loss, and it's in alignment with the food hierarchy. But together with that, we also need to look at when food is being discarded, particularly at a consumer or post-consumer stage, the labeling structure that goes with it. So all of this means that we need a much more practical, tangible approach, but we need it across the value chain in a concerted way. What that means is that we need to be clear in terms of the role players all along the way. The way that it actually works is that we need, therefore, to engage directly with the agricultural sector, whether it comes to the farmers, the landowners, but we need to track it all along the way in terms of all the different stages of the supply chain itself, whether it is the storage, whether it is the packaging, whether it is the part that hits the retailers, or whether it's the part that actually hits the consumers themselves. And part of this means that my difficulty with all of this is that a lot of times it's pretty much a talk shop. We're talking about these things as far as all of the different measures that are needed, but we don't see this translated into action. Absolutely. And dare I say it, this is where the government could actually play a key role in connecting the red thread as industry, as private players go on and go about implementing it. So for this part of it, it means that it's a concerted effort where clear roles and definitions need to take place. We need these tangible actions, and all of this will unlock a space for innovation to take place. And that in itself is a conversation.
And I know Andy's quite passionate about that as well. I see him nodding there, Andy. I mean, in terms of, government and who else should be creating this enabling environment and bring in civil society as well.
Absolutely. What we've seen since the start of the pandemic in 2020 is that civil society has taken a front role in making sure that social safety nets are addressed. Government has really been lacking in addressing this process. But as Jashila has mentioned, that throughout our food supply chain, there are opportunities that we can grasp right now if we just have the political will to be able to do this. So, for example, on the agricultural side, farmers, we find that roughly 8 to 15% of agri surplus ends up as loss or wasted goods. So we engage with farmers as part of our second harvest program, and we while farmers are harvesting for a retailer that requires a very specific size tomato or whatever the case may be, we take all this surplus offtakes that's out of specification, the other ugly stuff, the things that are bruised, but they're still good for human consumption. On the food processing and the manufacturing side, roughly 49% of that food is being lost or wasted. And there are huge opportunities there where we can grab that food, use that food to feed people, intercept it and recover it at the stage where it is still good for human consumption. And there are huge spin-offs from this. For example, one of the things that our organization Food Forward SA does is we take that food from our food donors and we donate it to organizations that are focusing on education, skills development, youth, and women. And so our food is used as a catalyst in underserved communities to be able to strengthen communities. So, for example, young people that are completing courses on how to do job readiness programs, how to do different skills, we are providing the food to make sure they stay in the program so that they complete the course, so that they are job ready, so they have a skill when they complete that course. And there are other beneficiation opportunities that come from this. So we receive tomatoes, surplus tomatoes from some farmers, and we are able to use a jam manufacturer and make tomato jam from tomatoes that we get for free. And then the cost to us is to only make sure that we make a shelf-stable product, and we can donate that onwards, or we can even have industries that sell those into communities for better prices those are the kind of things we should be looking at, opportunities. What government also needs to do is provide legislation that regulates surplus food donations. Countries like the US, Italy, France, all of those countries have donation policies that regulate how these donations are used so that we have less organic waste going to landfill, that we save the environment, and at the same time, we are able to use this to feed people, to get our people healthy so that they can go and look for work. As we heard earlier, Daniel Silke saying, 45%, when you look at the broad definition of unemployment, of our people are unemployed. And we need to make sure that they are healthy, that they are job ready, and there are opportunities throughout the food supply chain to be able to do that.
Absolutely, Andy, and we are having a little bit of a problem there, but thanks very much. We're having a problem with your sound. Let's hope it sorts itself out. But just picking up on that and what you had to say, and Prof. Alodia, like we were talking about inequality and poverty, and we speak about the haves and the have-nots, and we continue to have a growing population in our country. We have an unemployment problem, like Andy has been talking about, and I want you to just give us some idea, because we know food prices aren't about to drop anytime soon, right? And there's just not enough money for people to go out and get the healthy food that they need. And of course, this hits the have-nots more than those who actually have resources. I want you to link that to Sophia has sent us a comment saying, are our youth prepared to work in the sectors that are needing resources to make a difference immediately? How do we reward them in terms of things like maybe data allocation, airtime, and wages? And just picking up from what Andy said and what it is that you are so passionate about when it comes to this in terms of ending hunger. How do we make it sort of a multi-tiered solution? How do we come up with that? Who needs to come up with that?
So I think it helps to kind of think about how we've ended up kind of in this situation. And Marx made the point that the system is broken. Yes. So since the 1970s, we've followed a set of economic policies that has promoted globalization and has promoted specialization, and kind of our food production has followed that system. So we import larger amounts of our food. Lots of our productions exported. We're part of a global food system that is highly integrated, that is kind of highly financialized.
Yeah,
that might make some sense, and there are some benefits to such systems. But there's three things that sort of integrated system might kind of expose you to. Firstly, when that system's under stress through those supply chains kind of closing down because kind of ships can't move, or if there's a war in the Ukraine and that international food system isn't operating, then there's high risks on your food system, and prices are going to rise, and that's that's the first issue we're seeing. I think the second issue is that it's kind of promoted food production at quite high scale, and kind of using a set of technologies that are not good for the environment. So it's kind of highly industrialized kind of food systems, which I think has kind of increased CO2 emissions, as I think Francois would say to you. The third thing that it's done is it's getting us all to eat more or less the same things. So if you look at global food consumption, we've increased massively in consumption of animal products. We've increased massively in a set of oils. That is both not good for our health, but it's also not good for the environment. And firstly, and that's to answer the question, it's meant that kind of employment opportunities which could occur here in sectors that are that do employ large numbers, that we'd rather import those goods at a slightly cheaper price. But if you do the full, so let's do the full maths. Let's kind of price in the environmental damage. Let's price in the health damages of these systems, and it makes sense to change that system to systems that are much more sustainable, systems that are going to reduce our risk, kind of systems that's going to increase employment. And I think we have to rethink this whole system and change kind of change how we run our food production system.
Okay, so a broken system might be something that we could fix, but climate, Prof. Engelbrecht, is partly some of it our fault, partly some of it is nature as well. But it's very interesting that I was reading the African Development Bank saying that Africa is the lowest sort of culprit when it comes to carbon emissions, but yet we suffer the most devastation from it. I mean, we account for only about, what, 4% of global greenhouse emissions, but the continent is so highly impacted. I mean, we only have to look at what has happened recently, right? And looking at things like drought, like you mentioned, cyclones, floods, and then, of course, compounded by desertification. So when it comes to climate change, specifically in Southern Africa, I want to ask you, what are the likely climate change futures? And if you could also forecast for us possible disruptive and things that we actually may not be able to see coming, factors that could happen in the next decade or two.
Well, let me start by saying that it is absolutely in Africa's interest to also contribute its fair share to what we call climate change mitigation. Although the continent currently is indeed responsible for only about 4% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, and the historical responsibility going back to the pre-industrial, to the industrial revolution, that's about in the order of 1%. Yet, in terms of future climate change impacts that become more and more severe in Africa at higher levels of global warming, it's absolutely in our interest that we grow our economy in a sustainable and renewable way, rather than through fossil fuels, to contribute to this global effort that we need in terms of climate change mitigation. Now, the danger is that we are on the threshold of exceeding the first dangerous level of global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Yeah.
Now, the best estimate that we have is that we are going to exceed that level in the early 2030s. It's now more likely than not, even in the presence of an international best effort in mitigation, that we will exceed that first dangerous level. That's the first potential global tipping point in the climate system.
And that's not far off the 2030s,
The early 2030s is upon us, unfortunately. And at the current rate of greenhouse gas emissions, we will exceed the 2 degrees Celsius threshold of global warming, most likely somewhere in the 2040s. Now, this level of global warming can still be avoided, but it requires a strong international collaboration in terms of climate change mitigation, starting with the two superpowers in the world that are still responsible for 45% of the world's emissions as we are having this meeting today.
Yeah.
But also, if we add up all the small emitters, all the countries such as ourselves, 1.5% or less of the emissions, they contribute 30% of the world's emissions. So you can't just say you're a small emitter as a country. All the small countries also need to be part of the transition. Now, in terms of impacts, the biggest risk, I think, if we think about food systems, and maybe if we think about, at times at least, having to rely more on our own food production in Southern Africa than maybe in the past. The biggest risk here is a major, long-lasting drought across the summer rainfall region of Southern Africa. Now, I'm talking of a type of drought we have no historical experience of. So an unprecedented drought that will cause the levels of the mega dams in the east to fall below 20%, including the Val Dam's level falling to below 20%. This has never happened before.
Yeah.
But in 2016, at the end of the climate change field El Nino event, the level of the Vaal Dam dropped to about 25%. Should it fall to below 20%, the water supply to the Gauteng province is compromised for engineering reasons, pumping the water uphill, and water quality reasons. Now just think what will happen then if we have a major water shortage lasting for months across the industries and households of Gauteng. How will water allocations work, sharing that water between urban needs and agriculture? These questions are already being asked currently in the Eastern Cape. It was a major issue, allocations in the Cape Town drought, 2015 to 17. But what if we have such a day zero type drought affecting the Gauteng province and the largest summer rainfall region, directly impacting on the maize crop, directly impacting on the cattle industry? This type of drought is for the first time a risk. The risk for this type of drought already exists, and it will increase in the next 20 years as global warming continues.
Prof, I'm about to change your name to Prof Doom and Gloom at this point. I just want to read some comments that have come through. Kolel was saying, we have plenty of agricultural land in communal areas and all people need is infrastructure. We have enough working knowledge in producing food sustainability. I think that's what Kolelwa means to say. Jenny says, collaborative efforts with industry, education, labor, etc. are required to re-engineer human capital development in our country. The traditional ways of development of skills need to be considered in conjunction with new ways of engendering interest in sectors such as food production, farming, water preservation, alternative sources of energy, etc. And let's carry on with looking at solutions, Prof. Swilling, and just to look at the who. And that is a big thing for me, is the who. And let's look at the responsibility of local governments, for example. What is their responsibility for ensuring the viability and sustainability of our local food systems? I mean, can we absolutely depend on them? And I say that because we know corruption is rampant, just from the discussions before this, from what we have seen come out of our various inquiries. I mean, who can forget the stories of government officials making off with food parcels at a time of the riots in KZN? That is such a thing to fix, because I feel that if we can get people to just stop it, just stop doing things like that, we can, you know, do so much more.
Well, let me link a few things.
Yeah.
90% of all South Africans buy their food. So they are buying it from somewhere. So where are they buying that food? So in 1994, 25% of all food was sold through supermarkets. Now it's about 68%. We're one of the highest percentages in the world with respect to buying food from large-scale retailers. That's been a function of the democratic era. At the same time, fertilizer prices are going through the roof.
Yes.
By next year, that's going to translate into a further escalation of food prices. Where do people buy their food? In supermarkets that they can't get to very easily. Who's responsible for the decisions about where those supermarkets are located? It's local government. What's going to happen when the food riots begin next year? And who are going to be the targets? It's going to be those malls again. It's going to be local governments who are going to have to start thinking about alternatives. And I would highly recommend they start thinking now. In my view, food riots is actually part of the solution, because it's going to focus attention on this issue in a very big way.
A necessary evil.
Yeah, I mean, and waste, just come back to the waste issue. Globally, 1 in 4 calories is either lost or wasted. If you add all of those lost or wasted calories together, it could eliminate hunger.
Yeah.
That's the scale of the amount of calories we lose.
Wow.
We've heard the figures for South Africa. That's a food system. That's a function of the way the food system works, in particular the industrialized consumer system via the malls and these bulk consumer systems. So my recommendation to local government, if you really want to anticipate the future, start thinking about local, circular, agroecological farming systems, which result in climate-resilient production systems, where you retain moisture in the soil, you build the humus content, you pull carbon out of the atmosphere, you create local jobs, and you start linking local farmers to local buyers.
Absolutely.
And that might well mean turning malls into farms, like it's happening in some cities in the US,
and bringing food back into the main street, back into the streets, back into the local supermarkets, in the townships and in communities.
And of course,
that's a whole different way of relating to food.
And teaching people, giving them the resources to grow their own, which Prof. Valodia, I think, will mitigate some of those the unhealthy part of people having access to cheaper food, is that you grow your own, you know what's there, and it's healthy food, it's good food.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, there's two key things. I think the type of scenario Francois shared with us, I think, is the reality we have to think about. And there's two things that flow from that. The first is that we're in the problems that we are, basically because some of us consume too much. Right? The world's an unequal place. You kind of heard from him the CO2 emissions from the two largest emitters. If we bring that to South Africa, the kind of upper classes here can emit CO2 at a rate that is equivalent to the first world. And I think dealing with that inequality problem nationally and internationally has to be the solution. Quick second point is health.
Yes.
Food has to be something that makes us healthy. These unequal systems are making us all ill. Partly because we're consuming too much, or partly because we're not consuming enough.
Okay.
And I think we have to fix that.
Well, we're just looking at the clock. I wonder where the time has gone, but I want to come back very quickly to Dr. Rajput and Andy. We were talking about solutions. Prof. Swilling was talking about the responsibility of local government to bring about those solutions. I want to know from you, do you think that government uses our civil society organizations, the likes of you, Andy, and Food Forward SA, the likes of Gift of the Givers, the likes of Rise Against Hunger, that as you know, to do their job, and that's just become the norm now. It's become the easy way out.
Absolutely, and I think the nonprofit sector, broadly speaking, is becoming very unhappy about it because more and more the demand for food is causing that they just can't keep up with the demand. What we think should happen is that civil society must play an important role in providing social safety nets, in providing food security, and making food availability more accessible. And I think one of the ways to do this is government should be providing subsidies to those nonprofit organizations that are making a social impact into communities. A lot of our nonprofit sector focuses on enterprise development, focuses on small business development, focuses on skills training, etc. And this is where we need to go. The World Economic Forum earlier on in this year, in their global risk report, said that there are roughly 5 countries that are at risk, politically and socially unstable countries, and South Africa is one of them. And so government needs to play a more key role in enabling civil society to be able to do more. With a large amount of people that are food insecure right now, we need to make sure that civil society is strengthened. Government can't keep using civil society as the scapegoat to make sure that we address food security. Government needs to do better in making sure that they support civil society organizations to be able to do that better.
Dr. Rajput, I'd like you to weigh in there as well.
I actually have quite a number of points that I want to get across in terms of developing solutions. One is that I take the point very well, and it's a very important point, that we're so heavily dependent on our larger retailers, etc., to be able to access food. One of the interesting things, I wanted to say good, but let's go with interesting things that came out of the COVID pandemic, is the rise of the smallholder farmers. As the supermarket shelves started to run empty, you would find that there are more and more smallholder farmers that started to actually come in prominence and to be able to provide supply of fresh produce through that. And we need to now leverage this. We should not be at a point where we go, okay, we've relaxed, the worst of the pandemic is over, but we should lean in much more in terms of supporting these smallholder farmers. And that's all the way down to micro enterprise level. That's all the urban and peri-urban farming on a township level that needs to happen. And all of this needs to happen at scale. So we need to have we need to foster a concerted effort as far as the development of this part of it goes. But this means also that there's a need for the development as far as technical skills, and as we scale, access to financing as well. Together with this, the other part of it is looking into the agriculture sector and having restorative ecosystems. So looking at sustainable farming practices, looking at soil conditioning, and to be able to actually make our agricultural supply chains a lot more robust, all the way upstream from where the food is actually produced through downstream where the food is being consumed. My final point is with regard to climate change mitigation measures, because I think that the points that have been raised so far are quite important, and I'd like to be able to translate it into practical measures that are needed for us going forward. So it's clear that we need to prepare for longer, more intense climate-related or weather-related disturbances, whether these are on a drought basis or whether these are on a flood basis, because this is not going to change. Whether we're talking about droughts or whether we're talking about sea level rising and all of the measures that are needed as far as this goes, which means that we need for more robust, or just we need disaster and public health plans to address these types of severe weather-related events. It means we need to protect our equality, but we need to prioritize climate justice, particularly in an unequal landscape as we see in South Africa within our marginalized people. And finally, we need to protect our farms and food supplies from climate impacts. And this is anything from looking at irrigation systems for droughts, new resilient crop varieties, looking at other measures such as silver pasture, when we're looking at cattle pastures, where the idea is that we're growing trees in traditional cattle grazing lands so that it actually automatically provides shade, etc., for the cattle. So in other words, much more robust, concerted measures in terms of resiliency.
All right, excellent. And Prof. Engelbrecht, very quickly, I'd like you to pick up on that in terms of what needs to be done and by whom to actually lessen the impact of climate change. And we're talking short to medium term, particularly here in South Africa.
Well, firstly, it's important to know that every bit of global warming we can prevent from occurring will, of course, lead to fewer impacts in Southern Africa and across the world. So it's a stark reality that should global warming reach a value of 3 degrees Celsius, the assessment is that we will have the complete collapse of the maize crop and cattle industry in Southern Africa. So it's important to realize that there are limits to adaptation, biophysical limits. If we take into account socioeconomic factors, then the collapse of these two sectors I've mentioned may actually occur somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees Celsius of global warming. So it's absolutely important for African countries to be stronger than ever in the climate change negotiations, so that we have very strong cuts in emissions globally. In the next 10 years, that's what the science tells us, we need to achieve almost halving emissions globally in the next 10 years, an immense challenge. Then we still have an excellent chance of restricting global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius. That's important for all African countries, that global climate change mitigation is successful. And we have to contribute our fair share in terms of choosing our own development pathway to be a sustainable and renewable pathway. And then in terms of adaptation, the one bit of good news is we really have well-developed climate science. It tells us what the main risks are, multi-year droughts, heat waves. To what extent can we adapt to these risks? And for that we need to have a very careful look, sector by sector, crop by crop, in terms of agriculture across Southern Africa.
Okay, well, we've come to the end, unfortunately, but I'm going to just steal 30 seconds if I can. I'm in trouble already, but giving each of you 30 seconds. If you had to choose 3 things on the wish list to solve this problem, what would those top 3 things be? We'll start with you, Prof. Valodia, because you look very enthusiastic to give me your answer.
I think we have to kind of solve solve this and many of the big challenges we face globally, we have to solve our inequality problem, because I think inequality is driving a large large amount of these problems. And that means both raising the incomes of those who don't have, but I also think, since we sort of talking to a group of directors here, I think part of the problem is that the wealthy have too much and they consume too much, and that has to change.
Okay. Prof. Sterling, your wish list?
Well, my day job is as a professor. My other job is I'm chair of the board of the Development Bank of Southern Africa, and we make decisions to allocate capital every day. And if I would say one thing that needs to change drastically is how we make decisions about what we invest in. Since '94, on the whole, we've invested in the wrong things. Everybody across the financial sector, public and private, have not focused, in my view, on the right things.
Okay.
So changing investment priorities.
Okay.
Secondly, we have to diminish our dependence on an industrialized global food system. And that can happen in very practical ways, supporting small farmers. And thirdly, we are going to have to think very seriously about how we restore our soils and build climate-resilient agriculture.
Okay, great. Andy?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I think firstly, from our point of view, is if we are going to grow our economy, if we are going to develop, we need to start by feeding our people. There's a large component of our population that are hungry right now, and we need to address that. One of the low-hanging fruits to do that is to look at, review, and come up with a food donations policy to assist there. Secondly, grow our economy, support small business, reduce corruption. That's the way to go. Thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much. Mine is very simple and straightforward. Enough with the talking, more action. We know where the challenges are across the supply chain, and now we need to go about addressing it. As it's simple and straightforward as that. We need the tangible actions. We need it to be outcomes driven. We need key enablers to be in place. But all of this means let's move straight into action.
Absolutely, I'm with you on that one. Thanks very much. And Prof. Engelbrecht, you can have the final word.
Yes, I would say the number one risk we have in terms of climate change-induced impacts on our agricultural sector is long-lasting droughts. We are now in a wet phase, a La Nina phase, but soon we will move into the next El Nino phase, and we will be in a drought cycle again. Now, in a warming world, these long-lasting droughts become more intense and they last even longer. And it's difficult for commercial farmers, small commercial farmers, or smallholder farmers, or even in local circular economies with local food production, to sustain farming during a drought that lasts for 3 to 6 years at an end. How is South Africa going to support our farming sector to remain sustainable during such long-lasting droughts? Secondly, what does it mean for our land reform program? From a climate change perspective, farming over the next 20 years is going to be more challenging than over the last 20 years. So how do we support our emerging farmers in the land reform program? And then finally, let's make use of adaptation funding. So the developing world is entitled to investments and cheap loans under the Paris Agreement on climate change. Increasingly, we should see investments such as the $8.5 billion just transition transaction being offered to us. We need to channel some of that funding towards adaptation, not only into our mitigation efforts, but also towards adaptation and specifically into our agricultural sector.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And on that note, I think that's where we leave it. Thank you very much to our panelists, those joining us online, and the professors. Thank you very much. Given us lots of food for thought, and I mean that with all the puns intended. Lots of food for thought. In the meantime, South Africans, keep doing what you're doing, and Ubuntu, and just give and do what you can. The haves and the have-nots, that's been clear. If you have, then you give. And you give freely and openly, and you give often as well until this problem resolves itself, or we get closer to those solutions. So thank you very much. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you to our audience for your incredible comments and suggestions as well. I'm going to pass some of these on to our experts, because they can include those in their research going forward and their suggestions going forward. A quick break before we come back with the next very, very, very enlightening discussion. And Nompumelelo Runji will be up here with her guest talking about new ways of tackling inequality. We take that thread further from this discussion. Thank you.
And welcome back to South Africa's biggest board meeting. Right now, we are going to begin with the panel on new ways of tackling inequality. Right, I'm your moderator today for this panel. My name is Nompumelelo Runji, and I'm joined by a very able group of panelists to help us unpack this topic today. It is already well established now that South Africa is the most unequal country in the world. And several studies, including authoritative studies at the World Bank and Statistics South Africa have shown that this inequality is multidimensional in nature. It's not just a matter of income inequality, which has to do with the measure of the Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income distribution in a country. This inequality is also asset inequality, consumption inequality, spatial inequality, wealth inequality, digital inequality. And it's not only economic, it's also social, it's gendered, it's racialized. So why am I mentioning all these things? That this topic is actually quite a complex topic that we're trying to unpack in this short time. So COVID-19, the pandemic, has not made things easier. It's only exacerbated the problem that we're facing as a country. And so what we want to uncover now is what are the root causes of this? What has been done? What has worked and what hasn't worked? And what can be done and what can be done differently and done better? And so to begin us with this, we are joined by Ms. Precious Zikali, who is based at the World Bank. She is a senior economist, poverty and equity global practice at the World Bank. And she's going to talk us through some of what the World Bank has discovered or uncovered about this problem. Welcome, Ms. Zikali. It's so good to be speaking to you. In the World Bank's assessment, what are the drivers of inequality in South Africa? You can give us some of the insights in the recently released report, the one that compares South Africa with other Southern African countries regarding the constraints, the opportunities, as well as the drivers of inequality.
Thank you very much to you and of course to the other panelists. So I think, as you say, I'm going to base my remarks on the two most recent publications by the World Bank. The first one was just a poverty assessment that was focused on South Africa, and the most recent one was a SACU regional inequality report. So I think for me, of course, when you try to understand inequality in South Africa, it's important to understand the context. Obviously, South Africa is starting from a high starting point. The inequality has historically been high, so the starting point is high, and therefore it becomes kind of difficult to tackle that. And just to put it out there, that the context is important. So in terms of the findings, the drivers and the features of inequality, the one thing that stands out for South Africa is that high inequality is underpinned by structurally high inequality of opportunity. And what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the inequality of opportunity, we define it just loosely as a situation where circumstances that you inherit at birth, it can be gender, it's race, it's location, it's the background of your parents. Those continue to have a very strong bearing on the inequality of outcomes that we see today. So when you look at the inequality of income or the inequality of consumption, that is driven by this high inequality of opportunity. And what it means, I think literally for me, when I look at that statistic, it means that sometimes you lose the quest for economic prosperity at birth. Because you are born into certain circumstances, you might already lose that quest, and that's where the issue of fairness comes in. And I think that is also very much dependent on the history of apartheid that South Africa has gone through. That's why I say that context is actually important in understanding the drivers and the features of inequality in the country. So, for instance, also linked to this, what we find is that inequality in household wealth is high. and that contributes also to the inequality of outcomes that we see. Intergenerational economic mobility is low. And as a result, that entrenches inequality of opportunity. And again, in terms of some of the factors, the disparity in factor markets, access to jobs, access to land, access to credit, access to any productive asset that helps with income generation. There are disparities in that market. This is what I mean by factor markets. So for instance, you know that unemployment is high. I think the most recent statistic from Stats SA is that the unemployment rate was about 35% in the first quarter of 2022. And of course, when you look at the youth, that's even higher. I think the youth aged between 15 and 24, that was around 64%. And I'm using the narrow definition of unemployment. And when you look at women, they also tend to be disproportionately affected. Then the other thing that is a feature that is very stark for South Africa is the extreme wage inequality. So you've got a population that enjoys roughly equivalent wages that are roughly equivalent to those living in developed economies. But at the lower end, you have people that earn wages that are comparable to those in the poorest of the countries. So just to benchmark, based again on the 2018 study, it showed that the average wages for the bottom 10% was less than the average in Bangladesh. But when you look at the top 5%, their wages were very comparable to Austria, which is an upper income country, a high income country rather. So that also contributes to that, and that's what the studies find. But of course, those labor market outcomes tend to also be very uneven across population groups. There is a substantial gender wage gap. So even when you control for education, you find that the gender gap when it comes to wages is quite substantial. So those are the things that I think stand out when you look at inequality in South Africa. But it's also important to note that there has been increasing frequency and intensity of shocks. We know, of course, the most recent is the pandemic, but we are also dealing with climate change. There's also the price effects, for instance, from the Russia-Ukraine war. All those shocks kind of make any gains that we make when it comes to reducing inequality very fragile, and therefore it's important that we deal with that. And I'll just end by saying what the studies show is that the government is doing a lot from a fiscal policy perspective. So there is high spending, social spending, which the government undertakes and which actually mitigates these unequal outcomes. But of course, when you look at the amount that is spent and the results that we get, I think more can be done to improve that. But of course, also when you look at fiscal policy or social spending specifically, the issue of sustainability also becomes quite key. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Precious. Now to turn to you, Ms. Pelisa Nkomo. She is the chairperson at Oxfam South Africa, and Oxfam has done quite a bit of work around poverty and inequality in South Africa. Now, for you, what are the pressure points when it comes to this question of poverty and inequality in South Africa?
Yep. In fact, let me build on the points that Precious has actually raised, in fact, including the previous panel. If I would talk about the issues around food insecurity, for example, is coming up as a massive issue. But then obviously what exacerbates the issue of food insecurity in South Africa is also an issue of land inequality, right? So the issue of access to land is a critical issue. Because in essence, and I think the point one of the professors was making was that 80% of South African consumers rely on supermarkets for them to access food, but actually immediately there's a direct correlation of the fact that people are confronted with issues of access to land. I think there's a second issue, is the structural exclusion in terms of economic participation, but also there's an issue around wage gap for those who are actually active, and particularly gender gap issues. But also at the heart of it, and I think let's break it down a little bit, the macroeconomic tools that are at the disposal of the state, that the state can actually use. The fiscal policy has actually been used immensely. And part of it, of course, is that the safety nets that it provides are extremely minimal. And that's why you're seeing the perpetual increase of the various forms of inequities within society. So, for instance, I mean, no one can survive on the 250 rands, which is $28, for instance. Knowing, for example, the cost of transport in this country, the cost of food in particular when households or communities are not able to produce for themselves. And immediately that actually, increase another spending. I think the issue, I mean, we have 2 million workers that have lost their jobs during the pandemic. And even before that, we've already been struggling with issues of high unemployment. We have youth unemployment that's sitting at 62% black, but in fact, let me say Black and African households, 40% plus are actually leading unproductive lives. They are disengaged by the economy. And there is no clear support for small, medium enterprises as well as informal sector. So there's a contradiction in South Africa in terms of what type of challenges we're confronted with and the response, the policy response packages that we are actually presenting to South Africans. And one of those is that we've been overusing the fiscal tool, and that's important. But also there's another way of regulatory regimes that you need to do. And the overuse actually, and let me just complete the point about the overuse and the fact that it's not sufficient, is that what has been happening is that we actually spending between 50 to 60% of GDP on social spending, but also we then spending less than 10% on industrial development. What it actually means is that we're building a society that is consistently going to be dependent on fiscal policy for support, but also in turn, we actually perpetuating intergenerational poverty, right? I think the point that Precious makes, for example, around economic mobility amongst African and Black families as well. So in essence, because also it speaks to the fact that there's a low asset, asset inequality, and it also then means that there's very little that the younger generation can leverage on except relying on social security system. So I think there are a plethora of issues that needs to be resolved. And I think the last point is the fact that the macroeconomic tools at our disposal, we're not using them efficiently. And in essence, we seem to be using the social security as the only safety net. But in fact, it means that from an industrial perspective, South Africa, for example, has lost 90% of industrial intensity between 2000 and 2020. What that means is that it means that we've lost industrial capacity. So in fact, when we talk today, we don't know what we're able to produce in South Africa. We don't know what we get to import from outside. That's the first issue. The second issue as well is that even during the pandemic, because most of the goods that were utilized during the pandemic were not actually manufactured in South Africa, is that we've actually had about 22% of industrial capacity that was left untouched, meaning that had we actually coordinated our industrial activities appropriately between government and private sector, actually, we would have actually been able to say, how do we shift? So more often than not, we apply what it's called in economics, not only new liberal system, but embedded into it, it's a laissez-faire system. So where you allow the markets to dictate what needs to be done, but it's happening at the expense of the economy. And what's then happened is that's why you're seeing this increasing number. Now, if you have 40% of Black women who are left disengaged in society, whom in fact are supposed to be holding families together, it means that we actually contribute into family and community instability, which amongst those as well is actually the issue around gender-based violence, actually, that we've experienced. For example, it's a misnomer for a constitutional democracy to have so many gated communities in South Africa because we're scared of crime, right? Crime is a sign of social instability, and also it reflects highly the fact that we are an unequal society. But we have the tools and the resources, by the way, to change the discourse, and in terms of ensuring that we integrate those that are excluded in the economy. But where we lack is political willingness.
Thank you so much, Pelisa. I think what the trend or the golden thread that I'm seeing here from what Precious has said and what you are saying is that this is a structural problem. And we are actually addressing symptoms of the problem. We're not actually dealing with the root. And I want to come to you then, Mr. Sizwe Pamela, speaking on behalf of COSATU here, to say, can you just unpack for us from your perspective some of those structural impediments, that have already been highlighted, but if we can go a little bit deeper so that we understand why it is that the policy responses that we have currently are not really addressing the core of the problem.
Well, firstly, I think the colleagues have clarified this issue, that it is structural. The context matters a lot when it comes to this topic. Remember, the system that we have was designed. It's not an accident. It was literally designed to prop up other individuals or other communities and to isolate and alienate others. So after 1994, we were expecting that the levers of the state that were used to design the system were actually going to be used to undo it, to dismantle the system. So when the gear policy was introduced in 1996, it was a mistake, because what the gear did was it failed to acknowledge that there were people who were isolated from meaningfully participating in the economy. What the gear said, it said, you are all free, you are welcome, now be competitive. But you cannot be competitive when you've been constrained and systematically constrained. For an example, if you go back to 2012, the NDP was introduced. As the Federation, we came out and said, if you read the labor and economic chapters of this document, these chapters are flawed. They are not going to fix the unemployment problem. They are not going to fix the inequality problem. The reason why we said that is because the free market was being put as a priority to say, no, let us allow the free market to help us to transform the economy. But the free market is not the one that rigged the economy in the first place. For an example, at the time, the tax, corporate tax was sitting at 34%. Unemployment was 25%. And the policy response was, let's allow the private sector to help us fix the unemployment question. Let us give the private sector whatever it wants. Let's cut corporate tax from 34% in 2012 to 27% today. A lot of money has been put in the pockets of the private sector. But where is unemployment today? The real unemployment is 46%. Now the question is, has the free market helped us to fix this inequality problem, or has it exacerbated it? So you have a government that has decided that it's going to take money and hand it over to the private sector with no conditions, with no expectations. And yet the private sector has been very clear that the money that you give us, we are going to actually automate and mechanize using that very same money. Let's look at the education system, the commodification of the education system now. You go to townships. In fact, COVID-19 exposed these inequalities. In townships, you have a ratio of 1 teacher to 85 students. In private schools, you have a ratio of 1 teacher to 25 students. Then you don't expect that the students in townships and students in private school are going to compete fairly. And yet we say education is an equalizer. Education is not an equalizer. It depends what kind of education you give to people. Yet the policy response is that, well, let's send people to school. Yes, you can send people to school. Let's look at the teachers who are teaching these students. You have teachers who are struggling. 70% of public servants don't have houses in this country. So what's that got to do with anything? It's got a lot to do with the fact that instead of these teachers focusing on teaching students, they moonlight. They are selling Herbalife, they are selling all sorts of things outside. Why? Because they are supplementing their income. The reason why they are doing that is because we have said we are not going to educate their kids at a higher education level because they are public servants. We have said that we are not going to give them RDP houses because they are public servants. At the same time, they don't qualify for bonds. At the same time, they have to spend money educating their own kids. So how we have approached this issue is actually sad because it's not as if we don't know that the apartheid regime inherited an unequal system of colonialism, and it decided to actually exacerbate it in how it designed it. And in 1994, we come out and say, well, we are all equal. No, the problem here is not actually that complicated. It comes from the fact that we have a lack of political will to do what needs to be done. Look at, for an example, the Competition Commission's reports. The Competition Commission comes out and says corporations in this country have been fixing the price of bread. Not just the price of bread, you can go to telecommunication, you can go to the construction sector. And what has happened? Nothing. instead of these monopolies being dismantled and people being prosecuted, we decided that they needed to actually confess, pay 10%, and move on with their lives. But who were they pickpocketing? The poor, people on social welfare. We have 22 million people on welfare. If you fix the price of bread in this country, why is it that you expect the inequality not to persist? So there is a lack of political will. We have made deliberate wrong policy choices, and we pretend as if we don't know that this system was designed and using the levers of the state, and for it to be dismantled, the levers of the state needs to be used. You look at public procurement, R1 trillion worth of public procurement. The state is the biggest client, yet the state hands over money to the empowered. Let's look at Medupi and Kusile, for an example, just practical examples. Who was doing catering at Medupi and Kusile? It was Bidvest Catering, one of the most powerful companies in South Africa. Yet how many small medium enterprises were supposed to benefit? And what happened? So if you empower the empowered, if you continue to take money out of the fiscus and hand it over to the private sector, if you don't fix the issue of an uneven education system, then we are going to continue to have the problem of inequality. So I like what the colleagues have said, because they've made it very clear that context matters on this question. So this question is not that complicated. So on a daily basis, when you have a budget, that says nothing about rural economy, that says nothing about the township economy, then you shouldn't be shocked when you are the most unequal country in the world.
Actually, it's very interesting, because we are trying to build an equal society on the foundation of an unequal system that we inherited in the past, and obviously the legacies of that system still abound and they're still with us. And you have mentioned political will. Both you and Pelisa Sizwe have mentioned political will. So I want to move on now to Professor Murray Leibrand, and he is the NRF Chair for Inequality and Poverty at UCT. And I just want to bring him in here to ask the question that, are we actually paying lip service when it comes to this whole idea about transformation, transforming this society, having a developmental state, and what does it mean then for the social compact on a new South Africa?
Yeah, good day, and a really good question to link particularly the first session that we had today to this discussion, because there's no doubt that, and the inputs of the speakers now have made it perfectly clear that the livelihoods and the abilities of many South Africans to participate in the economy in an inclusive way are severely limited by our inequalities. And the failures of us to grasp as a national project and as a national goal that limits us as a country, it limits our potential productivity in the economy. We're not using our citizens, we're not believing in our citizens. And so I think it certainly is true that this vision, the impacts of inequalities on the ordinary lives of South Africans and their abilities to be productive and to flourish is a fact, and it's a reality, and all of the speakers have teased out aspects of that. But that said, I don't think it's true that that's our guiding vision, our guiding social project then is to confront that and confront it directly. I don't think we really believe integrally as a society that that's our grand project. That was certainly the project that was sketched out in the Reconstruction and Development Program, and in 1994, that was the society we set out to build. That's the society reflected in the Constitution. But I don't think it's the driving vision of where we've gone. Despite that, the evidence that's been put on the table right now is makes it an imperative that we move towards that. And the discussion of a social compact is shrouded in that discussion. We know that our president is much enamored with the discussions of building a social compact or renewing the social compact, which reflects the fact that, you know, even our president thinks that it's broken to some extent. I'm not sure we've ever constructed the social compact around this issue, but it's sometimes called the grand bargain. And what is it supposed to do? What is a social compact supposed to do to cut into the situation where we've got structural inequality that's stifling us as a country? Well, a social compact is exactly supposed to be able to break into that and to look for situations where you can confront those structural impediments with each member of society having a role to play. The government certainly has big, very strong roles to play, as we've heard, but so too does business in the spirit of today's engagement, and even within each factory, which we'll come back to. But so where do we go? So reflecting the fact that we don't have the social compact, but everybody's talking about the need for it, and the president is frequently convening big meetings of the business community, and we've got NEDLAC as a formal institution to broker a discussion between business, labor, and the community constituencies. Well, I think that and very much in the spirit of today, a number of people, even Dr. Sooliman right at the beginning, spoke about the need to be assertive. If you really believe that we need to construct a society of the sort that we're talking about now, that's going to break with the past, well, then you need to be assertive when you push into that space. So these engagements between government and business, or within NEDLAC, around what we need to do to create jobs in our economy. There needs to be a recognition that if you're going to construct a social compact, it comes with mutual accountability. So I feel, for example, that within within NEDLAC, for example, there hasn't been enough pushback to government in their failures to provide the broad infrastructure that we all need. That's the foundation for inclusive growth, for a flourishing society. The last decade has seen us going backwards in terms of transport, in terms of electricity, in terms of roads, in terms of spectrum, internet spectrum, things that have been surfaced today as crucial infrastructure for companies, but for everybody to be able to participate in the economy. I don't think that the unions and business have been assertive enough in saying, look, if you want to engage with us, then, you know, we're also going to hold you to account. That's how social compacts work. They actually ensure common cause. And then one can push to business to say the issues that arose, for example, about the food value chain. These are very tricky and very difficult because you're confronting structures. You're confronting the structures of the economy, of the formal sector. It's not an easy discussion, but you can push back with some credibility on this notion of a developmental state if you are doing your bedrock responsibility as part of the social compact. So
Thank you so much,
Yeah.
Prof. I'm just going to now take us to Ms. Tsotsi Memele Kambula on this point about, you know, some of the things that we could be doing better, you know, some of the policy shifts that we could be taking. But you're representing South Africa's Social Security Agency, SASSA. And one of the things that I think is important for us to understand is how effective is SASSA from your perspective? We've heard the immense importance of social assistance and social policy to this discussion about narrowing inequality and providing that net. But we've also heard that the net is not enough. It's not solid enough to catch as many people as it should. So the question, therefore, is how effective do you think SASSA is in its mandate? What are the constraints that you're facing? And what can be done to help SASSA become more effective in its own role that it's playing?
In terms of effectiveness, with regards to us executing our responsibility as an agency of Department of Social Development, I believe we are effective. We are getting the 200 billion that we have in our hands to those people that we needed to get it to. We currently, on the 200 billion side, provide that particular grant to those people that are actually most vulnerable, which is the elderly, the children of which are the majority, because the child support grant, yes, in terms of the amount, it's below the poverty threshold, but the amount of money that we provide holistically, it's to 12 million children, which is to 7 million beneficiaries, which is the caregivers. And the other big grant that we provide is actually to the elderly, which again is vulnerable people, and to people, persons with disability. For me, I think the biggest opportunity that we have, and I'm not sure as to whether we're discussing that enough as a collective, as a South Africa, is on the people that are between 18 and 59, because that's a huge group that has just come into the fold of the social net, that we're giving the 350, which obviously, as indicated, is definitely not enough. But the opportunities, because the people that are there are mostly young people, it becomes important and imperative for us as a collective, including the private sector and labor, for us to look at 4 million people that have got matric, that have never worked, that don't have opportunities at all. It therefore means that we need to join hands. And we have another 4 million people that are also having a grade 10, that don't work and don't seem to have an opportunity for them to be able to work. Yes, as part of government, what we're currently doing is to look at those that actually come through the child support grant process and ensure that when they have to get an opportunity to get a NSFAS grant, they don't have to go through all the different processes that they go through. So that's one of the things that we do. But I think the challenge is the fact that we don't have a coordinated approach as all of government, the private sector, and labor, in terms of looking at some of this data that I think for me present interesting opportunities in terms of us saying, what is this telling us? What is it that we need to do to make sure that we create those opportunities, particularly for the 60% of the young people that are unemployed? I mean, the numbers, about 1 million people last worked 5 years ago. So that's a huge opportunity. And almost 1 million people actually have degrees, but they sit at home and they don't have opportunities. And I think it's not only us looking at government and saying, what is government doing? It's us together with the private sector saying, what is it that we need to do to harness these skills and to give our children hope? Because currently our children don't have hope. Whether they are from the middle class or they are from poor people, we need to give that hope, but give hope by making sure that we look at this data that actually exists and say, it's not just data, it's actually people. What is it that we need to do collectively to make sure that we create a better life for all and get our children out of this rut that they currently are, because currently they have no hope. And this should help us look at what should we do differently. Yeah. Yes, we're giving the grant, but is it enough? Obviously, it's not enough. We need to look at what should we do differently.
And of course, social security is only one part of the solution. And Pelisa, you spoke about some of the macroeconomic tools that we are not making use of, that we should have been making use of as a country. Can you take us through some of those so that we can bring this conversation now towards what Professor Leibrand brought us to, the whole question of a social compact on this particular matter of inequality, of poverty, not just this, just the constitution, equality, etc., but actually dealing with the nitty-gritties. And I think it's important for this platform where we're trying to see how the private sector in particular can contribute to solving some of these problems. So let's go to that.
I think there are multiple approaches, and I think let me just leverage on the point that Sisbuso is making around the circulation of money at a community level, right? This 200 billion that gets into poor households every month. that is not captured, but it's just captured by monopolies because everyone else takes a taxi and go and spend it somewhere else and walk out of it. That's the first issue. So the first component, the way it presents an opportunity, is for better coordination. Part of that coordination is to actually encourage, what we'd call township economy or rural economies, right? Where, for instance, for food production, you do what is called local food markets, right? So that the dependency on food production is not only on supermarkets, but in fact, it's within Mamadlamin or cooperatives that are within that. But that's going to require coordination at a local level. And part of that coordination is actually dependent on two structures. One, it's the community, is what we call civil society organizations, which is one of the members here. That's one of the panelists was here earlier. That's one group. And then the other group is the municipalities. Because for you to coordinate local economies is that you need to provide local infrastructure to support the cooperatives that are on the ground. Now, obviously, historically, everyone else who sits today in the Department of Trade and Industry would say cooperatives don't work. Cooperatives do work, but the problem about how we've done cooperatives in South Africa is that we've introduced money where there's no money with minimal support to make sure that we support women. I mean, there is, for example, an interesting project in Kailija where a woman has started a sewing project and they're selling it through one of the mainstream companies. I'm not going to mention, I'm not going to give them free advertising. So through them, and they are supplying for the base in Kailija and they're supplying uniform for the whole of Western Cape. But again, that's where private sector had come into the party and say, we have capacity both from a buying power perspective, but also from a coordination perspective. So it means that the opportunities at a micro level that you need to deal with. I think the second component, it's around micro-industrial planning, right? Now the micro-industrial planning, it's linked into saying, what type of industrial capabilities that we have in South Africa. So I like making a simple example around the steel industry in South Africa. Is that the steel industry in South Africa, we manufacture a steel industry, but also we export without even processing it. So we manufacture steel, but we export at a primary level. And then it gets imported back in South Africa when it's a finished good, right? When you use your fork and knife, when you go into a hospital and when you go into a dental, all those things comes back into South Africa. Now, if you have a good industrial capabilities, amongst the key issues is to unlock and make sure that both private sector and government coordinates and make sure that in the value chain of steel manufacturing, everyone else. Let me make the last point around macroeconomic policy, the monetary leg of monetary tools that are not used. For example, now we're confronted with interest rates, right? Interest rates are a leakage in the economy, both at a household level and even at a business level. So small, medium enterprises are not going to be able to be supported. The other biggest intervention, we have to intervene early childhood development. Economic and social benefits of investing in early child development are showing to be so much significant. And you can link that with the social security funding that actually women gets to collect. But again, that's going to require a bit of coordination on the ground.
Speaking of coordination, I mean, we have NEDLAC. Why is it not working at that level, and how do we improve that? Because that's where labor, government, and all the social partners, business and civil society sit. So if we're talking about coordination, we should already have a sense there, at least at that national level. And why isn't it working? Why isn't it cascading down?
Well, implementation. Because, for example, we have economic reconstruction and recovery plan that we all endorsed and adopted at NEDLAC. But there's no movement, both from the private sector and government, in terms of making the resources available to implement some of the commitments that were made there. And if you go back again, we had the loan guarantee scheme. If you remember the loan guarantee scheme in 2020, that was meant to come in and help ailing businesses. One of the biggest challenges we had with the loan guarantee scheme is that we all agreed that we needed a loan guarantee scheme. But when it came to implementation, the private sector decided that they were not going to adjust the criteria that they've been using before COVID. So people do pay lip service a lot when it comes to commitments at NEDLAC. The ESCOM Social Compact, you remember that COSATU proposed, that was about how to turn around the issue of electricity supply in South Africa. We all endorsed it and supported it at NEDLAC, I think it's 3 years ago now. So 3 years later, very little has moved. So yeah, NEDLAC is a good platform. In fact, the president keeps talking about a social compact. But a social compact should be based on sound principles of solidarity. When you have a banking sector that has neglected small medium enterprises. 98% of South African businesses are small medium enterprises. Yet when you look at the credit gap that exists, something like 1.5 million of them are struggling to get access to credit. They are left at the hands of abomashonisa and loan sharks. So why? Because many of them are rural businesses, are township businesses. They cannot fulfill all of these expectations where they have to bring statements that the financial sector demands. So what we need is to have a conversation, especially about the monopolies and cartels. If you look at the banking sector, the only way to reduce inequality is to make people to be productive. For people to be productive, they need to have access to funding. But in South Africa, if you look at funding, many of the banks, they are likely to give you R500,000 for you to buy a car.
Okay.
When you ask for the same R500,000 to start a business or expand a business, they will put so many hoops that you have to jump over that by the end of the day, you give up. Or you end up going to loan sharks who are going to charge you exorbitant interest. So the issue of funding, both public, the DFIs, development finance institutions, are not doing enough. And the commercial sector is also lagging behind. But for us to have a genuine and honest social compact, we cannot continue to have politicians and the elite of this country give themselves increases like they've recently done.
Yes.
At the same time, they say 350 is unsustainable.
Exactly. I'm going to have to catch you there because of our time. I'm going to rush back to Professor Lebrand just to close us off here. If a social compact will require solidarity as well as coordination, it will also require accountability. So, Professor Lebrand, how do we get that right? How do we get solidarity around this question of overcoming inequality? And how do we ensure accountability? You spoke about being assertive. Who must be assertive? Who must assert what to whom? Can you just break it down for us in the last, in the last 30 seconds or so?
Well, it starts with the vision, right, and leadership, and that has to start with the president. But credibly. And then I think one can push actually into the hard issues of how does one then create an economy post-COVID with climate change coming that's more inclusive, in which it has to be defined around specific things that people can do in partnership. So when we're talking about building an inclusive economy, we need to understand what life's like for labor market participants. And the point that Busisiwe was making about the need to think about the economically active and the support that they need to engage with the economy, whether it's as a small business person or as job search or whatever, they need. We need to understand their situation, and they need to know that we're working with them on that. And so it may need a type of grant that Busisiwe was talking about. Then from the firm side, we need absolute candor in how these value chains are working. We heard a lot about the food system earlier on. And it's tough because we've got an inherited legacy of a very long time of a very concentrated food system, and then great potential from the agriculture side and from the ordinary people side to actually participate in that. But there's a huge chasm right now. And so that's what a social compact is supposed to do, to try and bridge that chasm and put people to work on food security, on all of these value chains, to make sure that they are inclusive, but in line with the realities of the country that we have. So it's to break the failures that we have right now of coordinated places, and it comes home to roost. It comes into the factories. We've got inequality in our earnings in the factories. Productivity is a factory level thing. We need to engage in our factories in the same way to realize that we need to share the benefits of our productivity gains in order to buy in to a social compact. Thanks.
Yeah. Thank you, Prof. I think what's clear from this conversation, as I thank my panelists for their contributions, is that context really matters. And we understand the context and we have the solutions, but we need political will. We need to accept and that we need to promote participation in our economy. And to do that is that we need to see our people as productive members of society, invest in them. And that will require the political will to put the right policies in place. It will require candor, as Professor Leibrand has said, from the private sector to recognize that they also have some work to do here. They can't just reap the benefits of the system as they've done historically. And there is a role for labor to play as well in continuing to push the agenda of reforms at the factory level, at the firm level as well, because inequality is reflected in that as well. So we need to improve the productivity of our entire society and better coordination. I think that's the other thing that really has come out very strongly from this conversation, is that we do need a social compact. We do need better coordination, but that social compact has to be built on solidarity, an idea that our futures are intertwined, both private sector, the public sector, the community sector, and we need to see better coordination with that. So let's hope for the best. Thank you so much to my very able panel members, and we hope that you were enriched by that conversation.
So succinctly put there by my colleague Nompumelelo on the panel that she moderated in terms of how best we can ensure that we tackle inequality, and underscored by the fact that we do need a social compact. Fundamentally, nothing is possible in terms of sourcing solutions to drive the economy, socio-economic development, and of course the advancement of South Africa as a whole without ongoing camaraderie and partnership. So we appreciate her insights on that panel that was phenomenally moderated, and of course many of the participants who have joined us throughout the course of today with opening presentations, the keynote address, and of course insight and information that's been shared by our panelists. I think more than anything, as we do get to a close of this country's biggest board meeting, one thing is quite clear. We understand the mandate, we're well aware of what it is that we'd like to achieve, and perhaps it's along the route and the journey that we met by certain obstacles that tend to derail us. But fundamentally, the knitting is clear, and it is something that we do need to stick to as leaders within South Africa's society. So I trust that throughout the course of today's presentations and conversations that you've been able to not only accept the role and function of what other stakeholders need to do, but in your capacity, someone in civil society, a representative of government, or even a corporate executive, that you walk away from today's conversation having fundamentally understood the role that you need to play in your organization and in the spaces that you occupy. And through the collaborative efforts that we've underpinned, that's when we'll be able to move the country forward. Well, I would like to thank you again for participating in this year's 2022 Directors event. No doubt, phenomenal insight and information has been shared here today. Now, you might be sitting back and thinking, well, you might have missed a few snippets. Don't be too concerned, as there will be a thank you mailer that will be shared with you in the upcoming days on the back of today's conversation. And in that mailer, not only will we provide you with some insight into the conversations that have taken place, but we'll also like you to share your feedback with us, soliciting your feedback and experience through a survey that we'll share with you as soon as it lands in your inbox. We'd like to strongly encourage you to fill it out, complete it as robustly as possible. And the information and insight that you share will empower us to make sure that when we return in a year's time, in person this time around, we'll be able to build up on some of the positive sentiment that you've shared to ensure that we host an invigorating conversation. Don't forget that if you need an incentive to complete that, there is a 1,000 Rand Take-A-Lot voucher that is available. And given this year's current economic times, I think it's one particular voucher that will be well served. Again, we'd like to thank our speakers, moderators and panel members for their insightful contributions and participation in today's conversation, not forgetting the role and partnership that we have from BCX, your constant supporters, headline sponsor, and of course the Institute of Directors of South Africa for their ongoing relationship. It really has been a journey that will continue to evolve, and one that does see us doing our best to play our roles in our various spaces and spheres of society to address the inequalities, inadequacies that hold us back from really spearheading South Africa's economic performance. Despite all of the challenges, one thing that remains is that we have opportunity. And that needs to be followed up with action. So let's move away from today's board meeting, knowing exactly what particular actionable items we can bring to the fore to shift the needle when we gather in a year's time. Again, it's been a fantastic pleasure being your host for the 2022 Directors event. From myself, Gugulethu Mfuphi, the event organizers, and the technical team that have brought today's conversation to you, we thank you for your time and we wish you well.